Hello everyone, I am Mano Scaling, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, please like the video and subscribe to the channel, and also tell me where you are from and what time you are watching. Now get comfortable and relax. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Superstition Mountains of Arizona, in a place where the desert wind carries whispers that should have stayed buried. David Jones and I had been planning this hiking trip for months. We'd been friends since college, bonded over late-night study sessions and too much caffeine, and now, 5 years into our respective corporate jobs, we desperately needed an escape from the fluorescent-lit cubicle farms that had become our lives. David worked in accounting, methodical and precise, while I pushed papers in insurance claims. We were both slowly suffocating in our routines. The Superstition Wilderness, David had said, spreading topographical maps across his kitchen table back in Phoenix. Peralta Trail to Fremont Saddle. 3 days, 2 nights, perfect for getting our heads straight. I remember how his finger traced the trail lines, how excited he seemed about disconnecting from everything. David had always been the planner between us, the one who researched gear and read reviews obsessively. He'd bought us matching GPS units, water purification tablets, and enough freeze-dried meals to feed a small army. What he hadn't researched were the stories. The Superstition Mountains have a reputation. Even the name suggests something ominous. The Apache consider them sacred, and locals tell tales of mysterious disappearances, strange lights, and things that hunt in the darkness between the massive saguaro cacti and jagged rock formations. But we were city boys, skeptical of rural folklore, confident in our modern equipment and rational minds. We should have listened to the stories. The first day started perfectly. We left the Peralta trailhead at dawn, our packs loaded with everything David's spreadsheets deemed necessary. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of creosote and sage. The trail wound upward through a landscape that seemed almost alien. Massive boulder formations jutting from the earth like the bones of some prehistoric giant. Barrel cacti standing sentinel in the sandy soil. David was in his element, consulting his GPS every few minutes, marking waypoints, taking photos of landmarks. He'd always been like that, needing to document and organize everything. It was endearing, usually. That day, watching him obsess over our exact location and elevation, I felt a flicker of irritation that I couldn't quite explain. "Relax, man," I told him as he adjusted his pack straps for the 3rd time in an hour. "We're not climbing Everest." He laughed, but there was something forced about it. "Just want to make sure we don't end up as one of those stories, you know? People who disappear out here." "What stories?" "Google Superstition Mountains missing hikers sometime. It's extensive." I should have asked more questions then. Instead, I shrugged it off and focused on the rhythm of walking, the burn in my calves as we climbed higher into the wilderness. By midday, we'd gained significant elevation. The views were spectacular. Endless desert stretching toward Phoenix, the city looking like a cluster of toys from this distance. We stopped for lunch at a rocky outcrop, sharing trail mix and lukewarm water while David consulted his maps again. "We're making good time," he said. "Should reach the planned campsite by 4. That's when we first noticed something was wrong. David's GPS was showing our location as approximately half a mile northeast of where we actually were, according to his paper maps and compass. He frowned, powering the device off and on again, waiting for it to acquire satellites. "Weird," he muttered. "It was working fine this morning." "Solar flare?" I suggested, though I knew nothing about such things. "Maybe." But David looked troubled. He was the type who trusted technology implicitly, and having his GPS fail felt like a personal betrayal. We continued hiking, relying on the paper maps and David's compass. The trail was well marked, so navigation wasn't immediately concerning. But as the afternoon wore on, I began to notice other small wrongnesses. The sounds were the first thing. Desert landscapes have their own audio signature, the rustle of small animals in brush, the occasional call of a hawk, the whisper of wind through stone. But something was missing. The normal background chatter of birds had stopped. The silence grew so complete that our footsteps seemed unnaturally loud, echoing off the rock faces in ways that made my skin crawl. "You notice how quiet it is?" I asked David during one of our water breaks. He paused, listening. "Yeah, probably just the heat. Animals conserve energy, stay hidden during the hottest part of the day." It was a rational explanation, but it felt wrong. The temperature was typical for October in the Sonoran Desert. Warm, but not oppressive. And this wasn't the sleepy quiet of animals avoiding heat. This was the tense silence of prey animals hiding from a predator. We found our intended campsite just as David had predicted. A small clearing surrounded by ancient saguaro cacti, with a natural windbreak formed by a massive boulder formation. It should have felt safe, protected. Instead, the encircling stones seemed to loom over us like watching sentinels. Setting up camp took longer than expected. David's usually methodical approach became obsessive, checking and rechecking every stake, adjusting guy lines repeatedly. His hands shook slightly as he worked, though the temperature was dropping and he blamed it on the cold. "You okay?" I asked as he fumbled with his sleeping bag for the third time. "Fine. Just tired." But his eyes kept darting to the shadows between the rocks, shadows that seemed deeper and darker than they should have been with sunset still an hour away. I tried to start a fire while David finished setting up his tent. The wood we'd gathered was dry, the kindling properly arranged, but the flames kept dying. Every time I thought I had it going, the fire would sputter and fade, as if the air itself was hostile to combustion. "Having trouble?" David had finished with his tent and was watching my struggles with growing anxiety. "This makes no sense. Everything's dry, there's no wind." I gestured helplessly at the cold fire pit. David took over, applying his systematic approach to the problem. He rebuilt the fire from scratch, used different tinder, even tried our backup lighter. Nothing worked. The flames would catch for a few moments, then die as if snuffed by an invisible hand. As darkness fell, we sat in our cold camp, eating lukewarm canned beans and growing increasingly uneasy. The desert night should have been alive with sound. Coyotes, insects, the rustle of nocturnal animals beginning their hunts. Instead, the silence pressed against us like a physical weight. "Maybe we should have brought a camp stove," I said, trying to lighten the mood. David didn't respond. He was staring intently at something beyond the circle of our camp, his body rigid with tension. "What is it?" "Did you see that?" "See what?" "Something moved, out there between those two saguaros." I followed his gaze but saw nothing except deeper darkness. Probably just a coyote. Or javelina. No, it was... He paused, struggling for words. It was the wrong shape. Wrong size. We sat in uncomfortable silence for several minutes, both straining to see into the darkness. The beam of my flashlight felt pitifully weak against the vast night, creating more shadows than it eliminated. That's when we heard the whistling. It started soft, almost musical. A tune I didn't recognize, but that felt familiar in a way that made my teeth ache. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the rock formations in a way that made it impossible to determine direction or distance. David grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my bicep hard enough to bruise. "That's not wind," he whispered. The whistling stopped abruptly, leaving a silence so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. Then, from somewhere in the darkness, came the sound of footsteps. Not the soft pad of animal paws or the scrabble of claws on stone. The deliberate, measured pace of something walking upright on two legs. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. The footsteps stopped. "Hello?" David tried, louder than I had. Nothing. We waited, barely breathing, for what felt like hours. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear, and we retreated to our respective tents. But sleep didn't come easily. Every small sound, the settling of our gear, The whisper of wind through the guy lines made my heart race. I must have dozed because I was startled awake by the sound of David's tent zipper. I checked my watch. 3:17 a.m. Through the thin fabric of my tent, I could see the beam of his flashlight moving around our campsite. "David?" I whispered. "Everything okay?" No response. I unzipped my own tent and peered out. David was standing about 20 feet away, his back to me, flashlight pointed toward the rock formations. His posture was strange, too rigid, like a soldier at attention. "Hey man, what's going on?" He turned slowly, and in the reflected glow of his flashlight I could see his face. His expression was blank, almost peaceful, but his eyes were wrong. They reflected the light like an animal's, though that should have been impossible. "Just checking something," he said, his voice oddly flat. "What kind of something?" I thought I heard someone calling my name. A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the desert night. I didn't hear anything. David stared at me for a long moment, that unnatural light still glinting in his eyes. Then he seemed to snap back to himself, blinking rapidly. "Sorry, must have been dreaming. Thought I was awake, but—" He shook his head. "This place is messing with my head." "Mine too. Let's just try to get some sleep, okay?" He nodded and returned to his tent, but I lay awake for a long time after, listening to the silence and trying to convince myself that the light in his eyes had been a trick of the flashlight beam. The second day started with David missing. I woke to the sound of my alarm at 6 a.m., intending to catch the sunrise over the desert. David's tent was empty, his sleeping bag unzipped from the inside, but neatly arranged as if he'd taken care not to disturb anything. "David!" I called, my voice echoing off the rocks. No response. His hiking boots were gone, but everything else remained. His pack, his water bottles, even his GPS device. It made no sense. David was obsessively careful about preparation and safety. He would never wander off without supplies, especially after what had happened the night before. I spent an hour searching the immediate area, calling his name until my throat was raw. The only response was my own voice bouncing back from the stone formations, distorted and mocking. By 8 a.m., I was fighting panic. I tried his cell phone, knowing there was no signal but desperate for any connection to the outside world. My own phone showed the same. No bars, no data, completely cut off from civilization. I was considering hiking back to the trailhead to get help when I heard David's voice calling my name. "Mike! Over here!" Relief flooded through me as I followed the sound toward a narrow canyon between two massive rock formations. I found David standing in the shadows, smiling broadly. "There you are," he said, his voice cheerful but somehow wrong. "Sorry about this morning. Couldn't sleep. Decided to do some exploring." "Jesus, man, you scared the hell out of me. Why didn't you tell me you were leaving?" "Didn't want to wake you." He was still smiling, but it was too wide, lasting too long. "Found something interesting, though. Want to see?" Every instinct I had was screaming danger, but this was David, my best friend, my hiking partner. "What kind of something?" "Cave paintings, really old ones. Come on." He turned and walked deeper into the canyon without waiting for my response. I followed, though something about his gait seemed off, too fluid, like he was gliding rather than walking on the uneven stone. The canyon narrowed as we went deeper, the walls rising higher on either side until only a thin strip of sky was visible overhead. The shadows were so deep that even with my flashlight I could barely see where I was stepping. "David, slow down. This doesn't seem safe." He didn't respond, just kept walking at that same unnaturally smooth pace. When I called his name again, he stopped abruptly and turned around. His face was David's face, but wrong, in subtle ways I couldn't quite identify. The proportions were slightly off, the expressions too controlled. And his eyes, they had that same reflective quality I'd noticed the night before. "We're almost there," he said, and his voice was David's voice, but it came from too deep in his throat, like someone doing an impersonation. "I think we should head back. We still need to pack up camp and just a little further." Something in his tone made it clear this wasn't a request. I felt trapped between the narrow canyon walls with this thing that looked like David blocking the path ahead. That's when I realized what was wrong with his appearance. David had a small scar on his left cheek from a childhood accident, a thin, white line he'd always been self-conscious about. This David's face was unmarked, perfect. "You're not David," I whispered. The thing wearing my friend's face smiled wider, and I saw that its teeth were too sharp, too numerous. "Smart boy," it said in David's voice, but not smart enough. I ran. The canyon behind me erupted in sounds that no human throat could make, howls and shrieks that seemed to come from multiple sources, echoing off the stone walls in a cacophony of rage. I sprinted through the narrow passage, stumbling over loose rocks, scraping my arms against the canyon walls in my desperation to escape. I burst out of the canyon and ran straight for our campsite, not daring to look back. Everything was as I'd left it. My tent, David's abandoned gear, the cold fire pit. I grabbed my pack and whatever supplies I could carry, abandoning the rest. The GPS was useless. The paper maps seemed to shift and change every time I looked at them, showing different trail configurations. The compass spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north, but I knew roughly which direction the trailhead lay, and I started hiking, moving as fast as the rough terrain would allow. Behind me, that thing that had worn David's face was calling my name in perfect imitation of my friend's voice. "Mike, where are you going? Come back. I found something amazing." I ignored it and kept moving. But the voice followed me. Sometimes close, sometimes distant, always just David enough to make my heart ache with loss and terror. The day became a nightmare of wrong directions and impossible geography. Trails that should have led downhill instead climbed higher into the mountains. Landmarks I remembered passing on the way up were now on the wrong side of the path. The sun seemed to move erratically across the sky, making it impossible to judge time or direction. And always that voice calling after me, growing more frustrated as the day wore on. "Mike, why are you running from me? It's David, your friend." Sometimes the voice would change, becoming pleading, desperate. "Please, Mike, I'm hurt. I need help. Something attacked me. I got away, but I'm bleeding. Please come back." I hardened my heart against it. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't David. David was gone, and I was alone in this nightmare landscape with something that fed on identity, on friendship, on trust. As evening approached, I realized I was lost completely. Nothing looked familiar. The trail had vanished entirely, leaving me stumbling through trackless desert filled with cacti and loose rock. My water was running low, and despite my frantic pace, I seemed to be going in circles. That's when I found David, the real David. He was sitting under a large Palo Verde tree, his back against the trunk, staring at nothing. His clothes were torn, his face scratched and dirty, but he was unmistakably himself, complete with the scar on his cheek. "David!" I ran toward him, relief overwhelming every other emotion. He looked up at me with confusion, as if he wasn't sure who I was. "Mike, how did you... Where are we? I've been looking for you all day. What happened? Where have you been?" "I don't know." His voice was weak, shaky. "I woke up. Somewhere else. A cave, I think. Dark. Cold. There were paintings on the walls. Animals, but wrong animals. And symbols that hurt to look at." I knelt beside him, checking for injuries. He seemed physically unharmed but mentally shattered, like someone recovering from severe trauma. "How did you get out?" "I don't remember. One moment I was in the cave. The next, I was here. But Mike..." He grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "There's something else out here. Something that looks like us. Like people. I saw it. It was watching me from the cave entrance and it looked exactly like you." My blood turned to ice. "What do you mean exactly like me?" your face, your clothes, everything. But wrong, like a photograph with the colors slightly off. The implications hit me like a physical blow. If there was something out here that could mimic appearance perfectly, how could I be sure this was really David? How could he be sure I was really me? We stared at each other in growing horror, each seeing our own doubts reflected in the other's eyes. "Ask me something," David said suddenly. "Something only I would know." "What?" "Ask me something only the real David would know. Prove to yourself I'm really me." I thought frantically. "What did you call your stuffed elephant when you were a kid?" "Mr. Peanuts. And you wet the bed until you were 9 and made me promise never to tell anyone." He studied my face carefully. "Now, ask me something I couldn't possibly fake. The night before our freshman year final exams, what did we do instead of studying?" "Drove to that 24-hour diner on Highway 60 and had a contest to see who could eat more pie. You won with 4 slices of apple, then threw up in the parking lot." He almost smiled at the memory. "Your turn. What's the worst thing I ever told you about myself?" I knew the answer immediately, but saying it felt like a betrayal. "You told me you were afraid you were becoming like your father. Angry all the time, taking it out on people you loved." David's shoulders sagged with relief. Okay, we're both real." But even as we confirmed each other's identities, I could hear that other voice in the distance, still calling for me in David's voice, and now, mixed with it, another voice that sounded exactly like me calling David's name. "They're looking for us," David whispered. "How many are there?" "I don't know. In the cave, I got the impression of multiples, like a whole colony of them." "What are they?" David's voice dropped so low I had to strain to hear him. "Apache call them skinwalkers, shapeshifters. They steal appearance, voice, memories. They feed on identity itself. That's just folklore." "Is it?" David gestured toward the sound of our own voices calling to us from the darkness. "You tell me what else could do this." The voices were getting closer, and there were more of them now. Not just David and me, but other voices too. Other people who had disappeared in these mountains over the years, all calling out in perfect mimicry of human speech. "We need to move," I said. David struggled to his feet, leaning heavily against the tree. "I don't think I can go much further. Whatever they did to me in that cave." "What did they do?" "I remember parts of it. They were learning, studying me, like scientists dissecting a specimen, except I was still conscious, still aware." His voice broke. "They were inside my head, Mike, taking things, memories, mannerisms, everything that makes me who I am." The horror of it was almost incomprehensible. To be trapped, conscious, while creatures studied and copied your very essence, it was a violation beyond anything I could imagine. But you escaped. Did I? David looked at me with haunted eyes. How do I know they didn't let me go? How do I know I'm not still back in that cave, dreaming this? How do you know you're not talking to one of them right now? The doubt was infectious, spreading through my mind like poison. In a world where nothing could be trusted, where identity itself could be stolen and mimicked, how could anyone be certain of anything? The voices were close enough now that we could make out individual words. My own voice calling David's name with increasing desperation. David's voice pleading with me to come back. And underneath them, other voices. Hikers and campers who had disappeared over the years, all recruiting new victims for the colony. There, David pointed to a gap between two rock formations. If we can reach that passage... We helped each other across the uneven ground, both of us stumbling with exhaustion and fear. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for one person, but it led upward, hopefully toward higher ground where we might find a trail. Behind us, the voices grew louder, more agitated. They knew we were close. The passage opened onto a rocky ledge with a commanding view of the surrounding desert. In the distance, impossibly far away, I could see lights, the glow of Phoenix on the horizon. "There," I gasped, "civilization." But David wasn't looking at the lights. He was staring back the way we'd come, his face pale with terror. "Mike," he whispered, "look." I turned and saw them emerging from the passage we'd just climbed through. Dozens of figures, all perfectly human in appearance, all faces I recognized from missing persons reports I'd seen over the years. Men, women, children, all the people who had disappeared in the Superstition Mountains, now part of something larger and more terrible. And leading them were two figures that made my heart stop, David and me. Perfect copies, indistinguishable from the originals except for the predatory hunger in their eyes. They moved with that same fluid grace I'd noticed in the canyon, spreading out to encircle the ledge. "Nowhere to run now," the thing wearing my face said in my exact voice. "Time to come home," added the David copy. The real David grabbed my arm. "The edge," he whispered. I looked where he was pointing. The ledge dropped off into darkness, a sheer cliff that plunged at least 100 feet to the rocks below. "You're insane. Better than becoming one of them." The circle was tightening. The fake versions of ourselves were smiling now, and I could see that their teeth were wrong. Too sharp, too many, like sharks disguised as humans. "On 3?" David asked. I looked into his eyes. Really looked, searching for any sign that this wasn't my friend, that the creatures had somehow replaced him without my knowledge. But I saw only David, terrified and desperate, but undeniably himself. "On 3. 1. The copies stepped closer, reaching for us with hands that ended in claws. 2. Behind them, the other stolen faces watched with hollow eyes, waiting to see their ranks expanded. 3. We jumped. The fall seemed to last forever, wind rushing past us as we plummeted toward the rocks below. I had just enough time to think that this was a stupid way to die, that we should have tried to fight, that jumping off a cliff was insane. Then I hit water. The shock of it drove every other thought from my mind. We'd landed in a narrow creek that ran along the base of the cliff. Water I hadn't been able to see from above in the darkness. The impact was brutal, driving the air from my lungs and sending spikes of pain through my ribs. But we were alive. David surfaced next to me, coughing and gasping. Did we just get incredibly lucky or incredibly stupid? Both, I managed. Above us, the creatures were making sounds of rage and frustration. Apparently, they couldn't or wouldn't follow us down the cliff. We'd found a boundary they couldn't cross. The creek led us downstream, away from the Superstition Mountains and toward the desert floor. We followed it through the night, walking when we could, crawling when we had to, supporting each other when exhaustion threatened to overwhelm us. Dawn found us at a dirt road where a rancher in a pickup truck spotted us and agreed to drive us to the nearest hospital. We told him we'd gotten lost, fallen down a cliff, and been wandering the desert all night. It was close enough to the truth that we didn't have to lie much. The doctors treated us for dehydration, minor cuts and bruises, and exposure. David had some memory issues that they attributed to trauma and exhaustion. He never told them about the cave, about the things that had studied him like a specimen. We never went back for our gear. Let the Superstition Mountains keep our tents and sleeping bags as tribute. It was a small price to pay for our lives and our identities. That was 3 months ago. We've both moved since then. David to Seattle, me to Denver. We talk on the phone sometimes, but we've never met in person again. There's always that lingering doubt, that question that can't be answered with absolute certainty. How do you prove you're really you? The nightmares haven't stopped. I dream of caves filled with impossible paintings, of creatures that wear human faces like masks, of voices calling my name in the darkness. Sometimes I wake up convinced that I never really escaped, that I'm still in that cave being studied and copied. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in my apartment, I hear whistling in the distance. That same haunting melody I heard in the Superstition Mountains. It might be the wind. It might be my imagination. Or it might be them. still hunting, still collecting faces to add to their colony. I've started carrying a small mirror in my pocket. Several times a day, I check my reflection, looking for anything that seems wrong. Teeth too sharp, eyes that reflect light in ways human eyes shouldn't. So far, I look like myself, but every time I check, there's a moment of doubt. A split second where I'm not entirely sure who's looking back at me from the glass. David sent me a package last week. Inside was a photograph he'd taken on our trip. A picture of the two of us at the trailhead, grinning and posing with our oversized packs. We looked so confident, so certain that we could handle whatever the wilderness threw at us. On the back, he'd written, "Proof we were real once." I keep the photograph on my refrigerator now, a reminder of who we were before the Superstition Mountains changed us. But sometimes, when the light hits it just right, I swear I can see something wrong with our faces in the picture. Something subtle but disturbing, like we were already changing even then. Maybe it's just my imagination. Maybe the trauma of what we experienced has made me paranoid, seeing threats where none exist. But I've stopped looking at the photograph after dark, and I never, ever whistle. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the Superstition Mountains of Arizona, about 40 miles east of Phoenix, in a place locals call Dead Horse Canyon, though none of us knew why until it was too late. The trip was Jennifer's idea. Jennifer Davis, our marketing coordinator, had been pushing for a team bonding experience for months. She'd grown up camping with her father before he died in a mining accident when she was 16, and she claimed the wilderness would help us reconnect after the hellish quarter we'd just survived at the advertising firm. Robert Johnson, our art director, jumped at the chance to escape his recent divorce proceedings. Lisa Wilson, our account manager, needed the break. Her mother's dementia had been getting worse, and the constant phone calls from the care facility were wearing her down to nothing. I should have said no. Should have listened to the gnawing feeling in my stomach that started the moment Jennifer spread that topographical map across the conference table, her finger tracing the remote trail system deep in the Superstition wilderness. But I'd been having the dreams again, the ones where I'm back in that basement, 8 years old, listening to my stepfather's footsteps on the stairs above while I hid in the dark. My therapist said getting out of my comfort zone might help. We left Phoenix on a Friday morning in October, when the desert heat finally broke and the mountains called with their promise of cool nights and clear skies. The drive took us through Apache Junction, past the last gas station for 50 miles, into country that looked like God had taken a sledgehammer to the earth and left the pieces where they fell. Saguaro cacti stood like ancient sentinels, their arms raised in permanent surrender to the vastness above. Jennifer navigated while I drove, her GPS showing our progress as a blue dot creeping toward the edge of the digital world. Cell service died somewhere past Tortilla Flat, and the GPS signal flickered in and out like a dying candle. By the time we reached the trailhead, really just a widening in the dirt road marked by a sun-bleached Forest Service sign, we were completely cut off from civilization. "Perfect," Jennifer breathed, shouldering her pack. She'd invested in new gear for the trip, a 60-liter backpack that cost more than my rent, hiking boots that looked like they belonged on Everest, a sleeping bag rated for temperatures that would kill cacti. No bars, no emails, no bullshit. Just us and the mountains. Robert laughed, but it sounded forced. He'd been quiet during the drive, staring out the window at the endless expanse of desert scrub. His divorce was supposed to be finalized next week, and his soon-to-be ex-wife had been sending him increasingly vicious texts about their property settlement. The silence out here was probably a relief. Lisa checked her phone one last time, thumb hovering over the screen. Mom's nurse said she'd been asking for me this morning. First time she's remembered my name in weeks. "She'll be fine," Jennifer said, her voice gentle but firm. 3 days, that's all. The facility has your emergency contact information." We started hiking at noon, when the October sun hung overhead like a malevolent eye. The trail began innocuously enough. a well-marked path winding between creosote bushes and barrel cacti, with occasional glimpses of the jagged peaks ahead. But the farther we walked, the narrower and less defined it became. After 2 hours, we were following what amounted to game trails, marked only by occasional cairns that someone, maybe the Forest Service, maybe previous hikers, maybe something else entirely, had left behind. The first sign something was wrong came at sunset. We'd made camp in a small clearing surrounded by towering saguaros, their arms twisted into shapes that looked almost human in the dying light. Jennifer had insisted on this spot because it offered protection from the wind and a clear view of the stars. The temperature dropped 20 degrees the moment the sun disappeared behind the peaks, and we gathered around our camp stove, sharing instant noodles and trail mix while the desert came alive around us. That's when we heard the voices. At first, I thought it was other hikers. The sounds drifted down from the ridge above our camp, fragments of conversation, too distant to make out words but unmistakably human. Robert stood up, scanning the darkness with his flashlight. "Hello?" he called. "Anyone up there?" The voices stopped. The sudden silence was so complete it made my ears ring. Even the coyotes, which had been yipping in the distance all evening, went quiet. "Probably just campers," Lisa said, but her voice was tight. She'd been checking her phone obsessively, holding it up toward the peaks like she might catch a signal from the satellites above. "This far out?" Jennifer shook her head. "We haven't seen another person since the trailhead." We listened for another 10 minutes, but the voices didn't return. Eventually, we retreated to our tents, but sleep came in fragments. I lay in my sleeping bag staring up at the tent ceiling while the desert wind whispered through the saguaro spines above. Sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps circling our camp, slow, deliberate, always just at the edge of hearing. But when I unzipped my tent flap and looked out, there was nothing but darkness and the distant silhouettes of the mountains. Morning brought new strangeness. Lisa's backpack, which she'd left beside her tent, was found 50 yards away, nestled between 2 barrel cacti like someone had placed it there carefully. All her gear was intact: clothes, food, water purification tablets, but her first aid kit was missing. "I must have sleepwalked," she said, but her face was pale. "I haven't done that since I was a kid." Robert's camp stove wouldn't light, even though the fuel canister was full and the igniter sparked properly. The flame would catch for a moment, burning bright blue, then sputter and die as if something was sucking the oxygen away. We had to eat cold oatmeal and instant coffee mixed with warm water from our bottles. Jennifer studied her map and compass, frowning. "This doesn't make sense. According to these readings, we should be about 3 miles south of where we camped last night, but we haven't moved." "Maybe the compass is broken," I suggested, though the needle swung true when I tested it with my metal water bottle. "All 3 of them." She held up her backup compass and the GPS unit, both showing the same impossible readings. We packed up and started hiking, following what we hoped was the trail deeper into the mountains. The path seemed to shift when we weren't looking directly at it, straight sections becoming curved, switchbacks appearing where none had been before. The cairns that marked the way began to look wrong somehow, their stones stacked in patterns that hurt to look at directly. By afternoon, the landscape around us had changed completely. The saguaros gave way to strange, twisted trees that shouldn't exist in the desert. Gnarled oaks with leaves that rustled without wind, pinyon pines whose needles were the wrong shade of green. The air grew thick and humid despite the elevation, carrying scents of decay and something else, something sweet and cloying that made my stomach turn. That's when Robert disappeared. We'd stopped for a water break in a grove of those impossible trees, and Robert volunteered to gather firewood for the evening. "I saw some good deadfall back down the trail," he said, dropping his pack beside a boulder. "Give me 20 minutes." He walked back the way we'd come and vanished between the trees. 2 hours later, we were screaming his name into the darkening mountains. Jennifer and Lisa had split up to search while I stayed at the camp in case he returned. My voice was raw from calling, and the echoes that came back sounded wrong, like they were coming from directions that defied the landscape's geography. Just before full dark, he walked back into camp. But it wasn't Robert. Not entirely. He looked like Robert. Same brown hair, same angular face, same hiking clothes. But his eyes were different. They reflected the light from our headlamps like an animal's, and when he smiled, it went on too long, stretching his face into something that belonged in a funhouse mirror. "Find any wood?" Jennifer asked, her voice carefully neutral. Robert, this thing wearing Robert's face, tilted his head like he was listening to something we couldn't hear. When he spoke, his voice had a hollow quality, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "The trees told me not to take their bones," he said. "They have other plans for us." Lisa backed away, her hand moving instinctively toward the bear spray clipped to her belt. "Robert, you're scaring me. What happened out there?" His smile widened. "Robert's taking a nap, deep underground where the roots grow thick. He's very comfortable." That's when I noticed his hands. Robert was left-handed, had been since childhood, according to the stories he'd told around the office. But this thing was reaching for its water bottle with its right hand, moving with a fluid grace that Robert, with his chronic back problems, had never possessed. "Where's the firewood?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Burned it already," he said, gesturing toward our cold fire ring. "Don't you remember?" The ring was empty. We hadn't built a fire since the night before. Jennifer caught my eye, her expression tight with barely controlled panic. She'd noticed it too, the wrongness that radiated from our friend like heat from a fever. But Lisa seemed oblivious, focused on getting cell service that would never come. "We should get some sleep," Jennifer said carefully. "Long day tomorrow." The thing that wore Robert's face nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, sleep. Dream deep. The mountain is hungry for dreams." We retreated to our tents, but none of us slept. I lay in my sleeping bag listening to the sounds outside, footsteps that circled our camp in patterns too regular to be human, whispers in a language that predated English, scratching sounds against the tent fabric that could have been wind or could have been claws. Around 3 a.m, I heard Lisa scream. I bolted upright, fighting my way out of the sleeping bag, and burst from my tent with my headlamp blazing. Lisa was standing in the center of our camp, her face blank with terror, staring at the thing that had been Robert. It crouched beside the cold fire ring, its back to us, and in its hands was something small and white. Bones. Human finger bones, arranged in a pattern that made my vision blur if I looked directly at it. "Lisa found these in her tent," it said without turning around. "Isn't that interesting?" Lisa shook her head frantically. "I didn't. They weren't. Someone put them there while I was sleeping." "The bones remember," the thing continued, its voice taking on a sing-song quality. "They remember being warm and pink and useful. They remember typing emails and holding coffee cups and touching loved ones. Now they're just calcium and phosphate, dreaming of flesh." Jennifer emerged from her tent, machete in her hand, a tool she'd brought for clearing brush but now held like a weapon. "Stay away from her." The thing laughed, a sound like wind through a graveyard. "Jennifer wants to play protector, just like she did with Daddy, before the mineshaft collapsed and filled his lungs with stone." Jennifer went white. She'd never told us how her father died, just that it was an accident. "How do you—" she started. "The mountain knows all your secrets," the thing said, finally turning to face us. In the glare of our headlamps, Robert's face was a mask of shadows and reflected light. "Michael's basement games with stepdaddy. Lisa's mother, forgetting her own daughter's name while the cancer eats her brain. The lies you tell yourselves to sleep at night." It rose to its feet with inhuman fluidity, and I saw that its shadow was wrong. Too long, cast in directions that defied our light sources and shaped like something with too many arms. "You want to know what happened to Robert?" it asked, taking a step toward Lisa. "He's still conscious down there in the dark, feeling the roots grow through his chest cavity. Every breath is dirt and insects and the whispered prayers of everyone who's died in these mountains. He's begging me to let him go, but the mountain is so very hungry." Lisa broke. She turned and ran, crashing through the brush toward the trail we'd followed into this place. Jennifer shouted her name and started after her, but the thing moved faster than anything human should move, interposing itself between Jennifer and the fleeing woman. "Let her go," it purred. "The mountain will catch her eventually. It always does." I grabbed the camp stove, the one that wouldn't light properly, and hurled it at the thing's head. It connected with a wet thud, and for a moment Robert's face flickered, showing something underneath that was all shadow and hunger and ancient hate. The thing staggered, its mask of humanity slipping. "Run!" I shouted to Jennifer. We crashed through the undergrowth, following the sounds of Lisa's panicked flight. My headlamp beam jerked wildly as I ran, creating a strobe light effect that turned the landscape into a series of nightmare snapshots. Twisted trees reaching like claws, rocks that looked like crouching figures, eyes gleaming in the darkness that might have been animals or might have been something worse. Behind us, the thing that wore Robert's face was laughing, the sound echoing off the canyon walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. We found Lisa at the edge of a cliff, sobbing as she stared down into a chasm that definitely hadn't been there when we'd made camp. The desert spread out below us, but it was wrong. The lights of Phoenix were gone, replaced by a vast darkness broken only by fires that burned in patterns too regular to be natural. "The trail's gone," she whispered. "Everything's gone. We're not in Arizona anymore, are we?" I checked my watch. The digital display showed impossible symbols instead of numbers, and the hands on Jennifer's analog watch were spinning backward. "We need to get back to camp," Jennifer said, her voice hollow. "Get our gear and find the real trail." But when we turned around, the thing was waiting for us. It had dropped all pretense of being Robert. Its skin hung loose like an ill-fitting garment, and beneath it, something writhed, shadows given form, ancient and hungry and utterly alien to human experience. When it spoke, its voice was a chorus of whispers. "The mountain chose you," it said, "showed you exactly what you needed to see to come here willingly. The marketing coordinator with daddy issues who needed to prove herself in the wilderness. The art director running from his failures. The account manager desperate to escape her mother's dying mind. And Michael, sweet Michael, who still wakes up screaming about dark spaces and hands that shouldn't touch." It was right. Every decision that had brought us here, every choice that seemed like our own, had been guided by our deepest fears and needs. We'd been herded like sheep to slaughter. "What do you want?" I asked, surprised by how calm I sounded. "What I've always wanted," it replied. "To feed, to grow, to return to the world above and hunt in places where the lights never go out and the prey never suspect that shadows can be hungry." Lisa made a choking sound and pointed behind the creature. "Oh God, Robert!" He was there, standing at the edge of our vision, or what was left of him. His body was mostly intact, but roots and vines had grown through his flesh, emerging from his mouth and eye sockets like some obscene parody of plant growth. He moved with jerky, puppet-like motions, and when he opened his mouth to speak, insects poured out. "Help me," he whispered, his voice barely human. "Please, I can still feel everything." The thing wearing his face laughed. "Beautiful, isn't it? He'll live for years like that, feeding the mountain with his pain and terror. You'll all make such lovely additions to the garden." That's when Jennifer lost it completely. She screamed, a sound of pure rage and despair, and charged the creature with her machete raised. The blade connected with its shoulder, slicing through the false skin to reveal the writhing darkness beneath. The thing shrieked, a sound like breaking glass mixed with dying animals, and backhanded Jennifer with inhuman force. She flew 20 feet and hit a tree trunk with a crack I felt in my bones. Blood ran from her mouth as she tried to stand, her left arm hanging at an impossible angle. "Jennifer!" Lisa started toward her, but I caught her arm. "No," I said. "It wants us to break, to give in to panic. That's how it feeds. The thing turned its attention to me, and I saw myself reflected in its knot eyes, a scared little boy hiding in a basement waiting for the monster to find him. But I wasn't 8 years old anymore, and this wasn't my stepfather coming down those stairs. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my lighter, the old Zippo my real father had given me before he died. The thing recoiled as if I'd drawn a gun. "Fire," I said. "You're afraid of fire. The mountain burns," it hissed, "burns with the pain of all who've died here. Your little flame cannot compete with that heat." But it was backing away, and I could see fear in its impossible features. I flicked the lighter, and the flame caught immediately, burning brighter and steadier than it ever had before. The creature shrieked again and retreated further, its stolen flesh beginning to smoke and peel away. "Lisa! Help Jennifer!" I shouted, advancing on the thing with my tiny flame held high like a torch. "Get her on her feet!" The creature's form was dissolving, the false Robert skin falling away to reveal something that hurt to look at directly, a shifting mass of shadow and hunger that existed in more dimensions than human eyes could process. But it was afraid, and fear made it vulnerable. "The old ones bound us here," it snarled, "trapped us beneath stone and root and the weight of time, but the bonds weaken. Soon we will walk in your cities and feast on your children's dreams." "Not today," I said, and dove forward with the lighter. The flame touched the creature's core, and the world exploded into white-hot light. I felt myself flying backward, my skin searing from heat that burned hotter than the surface of the sun. When I hit the ground, everything went dark. I woke up to the sound of helicopters. Lisa was sitting beside me, her face streaked with tears and dirt. Jennifer lay on a stretcher nearby, conscious but pale, her arm in a makeshift splint. We were back at the original trailhead, though I had no memory of how we'd gotten there. "Search and rescue," Lisa explained when she saw me looking around in confusion. "I managed to get a cell signal around dawn and called 911. They said we'd been missing for 6 days. 6 days. We'd only been hiking for 3. "Robert?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Lisa shook her head. "They're still looking. The SAR team found some of his gear scattered along a wash about 2 miles from where we last saw him. They think flash flood, maybe." I sat up slowly, my head spinning. My lighter was still in my hand, but it was cold and dead. When I tried to ignite it, nothing happened. The flint just scraped uselessly against the wheel. The SAR team leader, a weathered man named Martinez, crouched beside me with a clipboard. "You folks are lucky to be alive. That's rough country out there, easy to get turned around. Dehydration can cause all sorts of hallucinations." Hallucinations. That's what the official report would say. 3 experienced hikers suffering from heat exhaustion and dehydration. Their friend lost to a flash flood that left no traces. Nothing about creatures wearing stolen faces or mountains that fed on human terror. But I knew better, and so did Lisa and Jennifer, though we never talked about it directly. Some experiences don't translate into words. We went back to work the following month. Jennifer's arm healed, though she never went camping again. Lisa's mother died 2 weeks after our return, and she threw herself into organizing the funeral with an intensity that worried everyone who knew her. I started seeing a new therapist, but I couldn't bring myself to tell her about the real monsters I'd faced in the desert. The dreams stopped, though. Whatever had been lurking in my subconscious since childhood, whatever legacy my stepfather had left in the dark corners of my mind, it seemed small and manageable compared to what lived in the depths of the Superstition Mountains. 6 months later, I read a news article about a group of college students who'd gone missing in the same area. Search and Rescue found 2 of them 3 days later, babbling about voices in the darkness and friends who came back wrong. The 3rd student was never found, though hikers occasionally reported seeing someone matching his description walking the remote trails at night, always just at the edge of vision. The Park Service added new warning signs about flash floods and heat-related illness. They didn't mention the other dangers. the things that lived in the spaces between the mapped world and the wild places where human rules didn't apply. I still have nightmares sometimes, but they're different now. Instead of hiding in basements, I dream about endless desert canyons and shadows that move independently of their sources. I dream about Robert, still alive somewhere beneath the mountains, feeding the hungry earth with his terror while roots grow through his flesh. But mostly, I dream about that lighter, how it blazed with impossible brightness when I needed it most, as if my father's ghost was guiding my hand in those final moments. Some protections run deeper than we know, carved into our souls by the people who loved us before the world taught us to be afraid. The Superstition Mountains are still there, still calling to hikers and campers with promises of solitude and natural beauty. The trails are well marked on the official maps, leading to scenic overlooks and established campsites where cell phones work and rescue helicopters can land. But there are other trails, older paths that appear only when the conditions are right and the mountain is hungry. They lead to places that exist in the spaces between reality and nightmare, where ancient things wait in patient darkness for travelers who've lost their way. I've never gone back, never will. Some doors, once open, can never be fully closed. But sometimes, late at night when the city sleeps and the darkness presses against my windows, I swear I can hear voices calling from the mountains. Familiar voices, speaking names I recognize, promising reunion with friends who should have come home but never did. And sometimes, just sometimes, I find myself reaching for that broken lighter, hoping against hope that the flame will catch one more time. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 32 years old. This happened in the Superstition Mountains of Arizona, about 40 miles east of Phoenix in March of last year. Our company had mandated a team-building retreat, and David Jones from IT had volunteered to organize a hiking trip instead of the usual corporate resort nonsense. 5 of us from Morrison & Associates agreed to spend a long weekend camping and hiking in the wilderness. David assured us he knew the area well. He'd been hiking these mountains since college. Sarah Rodriguez from marketing, Jennifer Brown from HR, Kevin King from sales, and myself made up the group. We were all experienced enough with basic outdoor activities, though none of us were what you'd call expert survivalists. The Superstition Mountains have always carried an ominous reputation. Local Apache legends speak of spirits that guard the peaks, and the area is infamous for the Lost Dutchman's mine and the dozens of people who vanished searching for it over the decades. David dismissed these stories as tourist folklore, and honestly, so did the rest of us. We were just 5 office workers looking to get away from spreadsheets and conference calls for a few days. We arrived at the Peralta Trailhead on Thursday afternoon in David's SUV and Kevin's pickup truck. The March weather was perfect. Clear skies, temperatures in the mid-70s, with cool nights ahead. David had planned a route that would take us about 8 miles into the wilderness to a secluded camping spot he'd used before, near a seasonal creek. From there, we'd day hike to some of the more scenic viewpoints over the weekend before heading back Monday morning. The first sign something was wrong came within an hour of starting our hike. David's GPS unit, which he'd relied on for years, began showing our location as somewhere in Nevada. He laughed it off, saying the device was probably picking up interference from the nearby radio towers. But when Jennifer tried using the GPS on her phone, it showed us in 3 different states depending on which app she used. Kevin's phone compass spun lazily without settling on any direction. "Technology," Sarah muttered, shouldering her pack. "This is why people used to navigate by the stars." But even David's paper topographical map seemed inconsistent with the terrain around us. Trails that should have been clearly marked according to the map simply didn't exist, while we kept encountering paths that weren't indicated anywhere on the paper. David grew increasingly frustrated as the afternoon wore on, though he tried to hide it behind jokes about government mapmakers. By early evening, we'd been hiking for nearly 6 hours when we should have reached our campsite after 4. The sun was beginning to set behind the jagged peaks, casting long shadows across the desert floor. David finally admitted he wasn't entirely sure where we were, but insisted we'd find our way in the morning. "There's a decent clearing up ahead," he said, pointing toward a flat area surrounded by tall saguaro cacti and brittlebush. "We can set up camp there for the night." As we established our campsite, small details nagged at me. The sounds were wrong somehow. Too quiet, even for the desert. No coyote calls, no night birds, none of the scurrying and rustling you'd expect from nocturnal animals. The silence felt oppressive, like a held breath. Jennifer noticed it too. "Is it always this quiet out here?" she asked David while we gathered rocks for a fire ring. "Must be an off night for the wildlife," he replied, but I caught the uncertainty in his voice. Kevin, ever the skeptic, was more concerned with practical matters. "So, we're lost, our GPS is fried, and you don't actually know where we are. Great planning, Jones." "We're not lost," David snapped. "I just need to get my bearings in the morning light. This area all looks the same after dark." Sarah tried to mediate, suggesting we just enjoy the adventure and worry about navigation tomorrow. She'd always been good at diffusing workplace tension, and it seemed to work in the wilderness too. We got our fire going, heated up some canned chili, and shared a bottle of wine Kevin had smuggled in his pack. For a while, it felt like a normal camping trip. We told stories, complained about our boss, and Jennifer tried to identify constellations she clearly didn't know. The fire cast dancing shadows on the surrounding rock formations, and the desert began to seem less hostile. But around midnight, things started happening that couldn't be explained away. I was on second watch. We'd decided to rotate guard duty partly for safety, and partly because David seemed genuinely worried about our location. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, and the others were sleeping soundly in their bags around the embers. That's when I heard the singing. It started as barely a whisper, so faint I thought it might be wind through the rocks. But there was a melody to it, wordless but distinctly human. A woman's voice, high and crystalline, echoing from somewhere in the darkness beyond our camp. The tune was unfamiliar but somehow ancient-sounding, like a lullaby from a culture I'd never encountered. I sat up straighter, straining to locate the source. The singing continued for several minutes, sometimes seeming to come from the north, sometimes from the west. It was beautiful in a way that made my skin crawl. I considered waking the others, but the singing faded away before I could decide. For the remainder of my watch, I heard nothing but the subtle hiss of dying coals and the slow breathing of my companions. In the morning, I mentioned the singing to David while we boiled water for coffee. "Probably just wind," he said, but he was studying our surroundings with new intensity. "These rock formations can create weird acoustic effects." "It was definitely a human voice," I insisted. Sarah overheard and looked up from her sleeping bag. "Someone else is out here?" "If they are, they're not using any established trails," David replied. "This area is pretty remote. It's possible someone's camping nearby, but—" He trailed off, staring at something behind me. I turned to see what had caught his attention. Our fire ring, which we'd carefully constructed with local stones the night before, had been rearranged. The rocks now formed a perfect spiral pattern around the cold ashes, each stone precisely placed. None of us remembered arranging them that way. Jennifer emerged from her sleeping bag, noticed our expressions, and followed our gaze to the fire ring. "Did one of you guys do that?" We all shook our heads. Kevin studied the spiral pattern and frowned. "Maybe animals moved them around during the night." "What animals?" Sarah asked. "We haven't seen so much as a lizard since we got here." David was already breaking camp. stuffing his sleeping bag into its compression sack with unnecessary force. "Let's get moving. I want to reach higher ground and get a better view of the area." We packed quickly and set off along what David claimed was a game trail heading northeast. The morning was clear and cool, perfect hiking weather, but the oppressive quiet from the night before persisted. Our footsteps seemed muffled, and even our conversations died away into uncomfortable silence after a few minutes. 2 hours into the hike, Jennifer stopped abruptly and pointed ahead. "There's someone up there." About 50 yards ahead, on a rocky outcrop overlooking our trail, a figure stood silhouetted against the morning sky. From that distance, we couldn't make out details, but it appeared to be a woman with long, dark hair, wearing what looked like traditional Native American clothing. David cupped his hands around his mouth and called out, "Hello, we're a bit lost. Can you help us?" The figure didn't respond or acknowledge us in any way. She simply stood there, perfectly still, facing in our direction. "Maybe she can't hear us," Sarah suggested. We continued up the trail, but when we reached the outcrop, no one was there. The rock formation was completely empty, with no obvious way for someone to have climbed down the backside without us seeing them. Kevin was the first to voice what we were all thinking. "That's impossible. There's nowhere she could have gone." David examined the rock surface for any sign of the woman's presence. Footprints, disturbed sand, anything. He found nothing. "Maybe we imagined it," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "All 5 of us imagined the exact same thing?" Jennifer asked. We pressed on, but the incident had shaken everyone's confidence. The terrain grew more rugged as we climbed, and David's attempts to match our surroundings to his topographical map became increasingly futile. Landmarks that should have been visible weren't there, while rock formations we could clearly see had no corresponding features on the map. By early afternoon, we were genuinely lost. David finally admitted it, though he tried to maintain an optimistic tone. "We'll find a high point and see if we can spot the trailhead or any other landmarks. The important thing is not to panic." But Kevin was already past that point. "This is insane. How do you lose a clearly marked trail? How do 5 people hallucinate the same person?" "Stress and elevation can cause disorientation," Sarah offered, though she sounded like she was trying to convince herself as much as Kevin. We found a suitable overlook and spent an hour studying the landscape in all directions. The view was breathtaking. Endless ranks of saguaro-studded hills stretching to the horizon, with the peaks of the Superstition Mountains jutting up like broken teeth against the blue sky. But nothing looked familiar to David, and we couldn't spot any trace of civilization in any direction. "We need to conserve water and find shelter for tonight," David said. "Tomorrow we'll pick a direction and stick with it until we hit a road or trail." As we descended from the overlook, Jennifer made a discovery that sent chills through all of us. Carved into a flat rock surface beside the trail were symbols. Definitely human-made, but unlike anything we'd seen before. They appeared to be pictographs, but not in any Native American style I recognized. The carvings looked fresh, too recent to be ancient petroglyphs. "Those weren't here when we came up," Jennifer said with certainty. David knelt beside the rock, running his fingers over the symbols. "They're definitely new. The cuts are sharp, no weathering." The pictographs depicted human figures in various poses, some standing, some kneeling, others lying flat. Around them were symbols that might have been animals or spirits, with flowing lines connecting everything in a complex pattern. At the center was a figure that looked distinctly different from the others, larger and somehow more menacing. Kevin's voice was tight with barely controlled fear. "Someone's been following us, watching us." We hurried away from the rock carving, but the damage to our group's morale was done. Trust was breaking down, and the supernatural explanations we'd been dismissing were becoming harder to ignore. That evening, we made camp in a natural shelter formed by 3 large boulders. David insisted on doubling the watch rotation with 2 people awake at all times. The fire seemed to provide less warmth and light than it should have, and shadows danced at the edge of our vision with unnatural movement. Sarah and I took the first watch together. We sat close to the fire, listening to the breathing of our sleeping companions and straining to hear any sounds from the darkness beyond. "Michael," Sarah whispered after about an hour, "do you think we're really lost, or is something keeping us here?" Before I could answer, we heard movement in the rocks above our shelter. Not the scrabbling of small animals, but the deliberate footsteps of something large moving with purpose. Sarah gripped my arm as the sounds circled our campsite, staying just beyond the reach of our firelight. The footsteps stopped directly above us. We could hear breathing, slow, deliberate, definitely human, but somehow wrong. Too deep, too rhythmic, like someone consciously controlling each breath. "Who's there?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. The breathing stopped immediately, followed by absolute silence. We waited for what felt like hours, but heard nothing more. When David and Kevin took over the watch at 2 a.m., we told them what happened, but they found no trace of any intruder. I barely slept that night, and when I did drift off, I dreamed of the woman on the outcrop. In the dream, she was much closer, and I could see her face clearly. Her features were beautiful but somehow predatory, with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. She was singing the same wordless melody I'd heard the first night, but now I could understand its meaning without comprehending the words. It was a hunting song. Morning brought new horrors. Jennifer discovered that her backpack, which she'd secured inside our shelter, was missing. We searched everywhere, but it had simply vanished. More disturbing was Kevin's condition. He claimed he felt fine, but his behavior was subtly off. He smiled too much, spoke in an oddly flat tone, and seemed to have forgotten details about our trip that he should have remembered. "Kevin," Sarah asked during breakfast, "what did you pack for lunch yesterday?" He stared at her blankly for a moment before answering. "Lunch? We had trail mix. Yes, trail mix." But Kevin had been vocal about his gourmet sandwich preparations before the trip. He'd spent 20 minutes describing his specialty roast beef and horseradish creation, which he'd been saving for day 2. David pulled me aside while Kevin was ostensibly filtering water at a nearby boulder seepage. "Something happened to him during the night," David whispered. "I think someone or something got to him while we were sleeping." "That's impossible," I replied. "We had people on watch the whole time." "Then explain why he can't remember basic things about the trip. Explain why he keeps staring at us like he's never seen us before." I watched Kevin working with the water filter. His movements were precise and normal, but David was right. Something fundamental had changed. Kevin's mannerisms, his facial expressions, even the way he held his head while concentrating, all seemed like careful imitations of the man we knew. We decided to test him with questions only the real Kevin would know. Office gossip, shared experiences, details about his family. He answered correctly, but with no emotional response, as if he was reciting memorized facts rather than sharing personal memories. "Kevin," Jennifer asked, "what's your daughter's middle name?" "Anne," he replied immediately. "She's 7 years old and attends Lincoln Elementary." Correct information, but delivered in the same flat tone he'd used all morning. The real Kevin's face would have lit up when talking about his daughter. She was the center of his world. Sarah voiced what we were all thinking. That's not Kevin anymore. The thing wearing Kevin's face turned toward us and smiled. The expression was perfectly formed but somehow hollow, like a mask stretched over something inhuman. "Of course I'm Kevin. Who else would I be?" David stood up abruptly. "We need to go. Now." We packed hastily while Kevin Thing continued his water filtering, apparently oblivious to our panic. When he finished, he shouldered his pack and looked at us expectantly. "Where are we heading today?" he asked with that same empty smile. David pointed toward a ridgeline to the east. "That way, we need to find high ground." As we hiked, Kevin Thing stayed close to our group, but I noticed he never sweated despite the climbing heat, and his breathing remained perfectly steady even during the steepest climbs. He also kept looking back the way we'd come, as if expecting something to follow. Around midday, we encountered a series of rock cairns marking what appeared to be a trail. David was hesitant to follow them, given our recent experiences, but we were running low on water and needed to find civilization soon. The cairns led us through a narrow canyon where the rock walls rose 60 feet on either side, cutting off most of the sunlight. Our footsteps echoed strangely in the confined space, sometimes seeming to come from ahead of us rather than behind. Halfway through the canyon, Jennifer made a discovery that stopped us cold. Scattered among the rocks were pieces of modern camping equipment: a torn sleeping bag, a broken water bottle, a hiking boot with the foot still inside. "Oh, God," Sarah whispered, covering her mouth. The boot belonged to a human foot, mummified by the dry desert air but clearly recent. Shreds of sock and flesh clung to the bone, and I could make out what looked like bite marks on the exposed ankle. Kevin Thing examined the remains with clinical interest, showing no sign of the horror and revulsion the rest of us felt. "Looks like someone had an accident," he said conversationally. David was studying the scattered gear. "This is all high-end equipment, expensive stuff. Whoever this was, they knew what they were doing." We found more evidence as we continued through the canyon: pieces of backpacks, shredded clothing, and worse things I don't want to describe in detail. It was like walking through the aftermath of a massacre, but there were no complete bodies, just scattered remains and personal effects. At the far end of the canyon, we discovered something that made our blood run cold. Carved into the rock wall were more pictographs, but these were different from the ones we'd seen before. These depicted the hunting and consumption of human figures by something that looked like a cross between a person and a wild animal. The images were graphic and detailed, showing various stages of what could only be described as ritualistic cannibalism. Below the pictographs, scratched into the rock in English, were the words, "They wear our faces now." "We need to get out of here," Jennifer said, her voice shaking, but Kevin Thing was studying the pictographs with fascination. "Interesting artwork," he said, "very primitive but expressive." David grabbed my shoulder and pulled me aside. "Look at his eyes," he whispered. I looked closely at Kevin Thing's face for the first time since morning. His pupils were wrong, too large for the bright daylight, and when he turned his head, they reflected light with a greenish tint that definitely wasn't natural. "That's not Kevin," I said. "I know," David replied. "The question is, what do we do about it?" Sarah had overheard us. "Maybe we're wrong. Maybe he's just in shock or something." "Sarah," I said gently, "Kevin is terrified of blood. He faints when he gets a paper cut. Look at how he's reacting to these remains." Kevin Thing was now crouched beside a rib cage, examining it with the detached curiosity of a scientist. He showed no sign of nausea or distress. "We can't just abandon him," Jennifer protested. "What if he's sick or injured?" "What if he's not Kevin at all?" David countered. We were interrupted by a sound that made us all freeze. The singing again, but this time much closer. It seemed to be coming from the rocks above the canyon, the same wordless melody I'd heard the first night. But now there were multiple voices harmonizing in ways that hurt to listen to. Kevin Thing stood up and smiled. "They're calling," he said with genuine warmth for the first time since morning. "Who's calling?" Sarah asked. "My family," Kevin Thing replied and began walking toward the canyon wall. David tried to stop him, but Kevin Thing pushed him aside with inhuman strength, sending David stumbling backward into the rocks. Then Kevin Thing began to climb the sheer canyon wall with impossible agility, his fingers finding handholds that shouldn't have existed. We watched in horror as he scaled the 60-foot wall in minutes, moving like a spider. At the top, he paused and looked down at us. For just a moment, his face changed, showing us something that definitely wasn't human underneath. Then he disappeared over the edge. The singing stopped immediately, leaving us in silence that felt like a physical weight. "What the hell was that?" Jennifer whispered. David was checking his injuries from Kevin Thing's shove. "I think we need to accept that whatever grabbed Kevin last night, it wasn't human." "Then where's the real Kevin?" Sarah asked. We searched the area where Kevin Thing had disappeared, but found no trace of him or any way to follow his path. The canyon wall was completely smooth where he'd climbed it, with no handholds or crevices that could have supported a human climber. As evening approached, we were forced to make a terrible decision. We couldn't stay in the canyon with its grisly remains and pictographs, but we also couldn't abandon Kevin if there was any chance he was still alive somewhere. David made the choice for us. "Kevin's gone," he said with finality. "Either he's dead or something else is wearing his body. Either way, we can't help him, and staying here puts the rest of us in danger." We climbed out of the canyon using a switchback trail on the eastern side, emerging onto a plateau as the sun began to set. The landscape here was different. More vegetation, actual trees instead of just cacti and desert scrub. It felt less hostile, but we'd learned not to trust appearances. We found a defensible campsite among some large boulders and built our fire in a natural depression that would hide the light from below. The mood was grim as we shared our remaining food and water. We'd lost Kevin. We were still completely lost, and our supplies were running dangerously low. "I think something's been hunting people in these mountains," David said as we sat around the fire. "All that gear in the canyon, the pictographs, the stories about people disappearing, it's all connected." "But what is it?" Jennifer asked. "Skinwalker," Sarah said quietly. "That's what the Navajo would call it. A witch that can take on the appearance of animals or people." "You don't actually believe that," I said. "After what we've seen, after watching Kevin climb a sheer wall and disappear, I'm ready to believe anything." Our conversation was interrupted by a familiar voice calling from the darkness beyond our campsite. "Hey guys, I found water!" It was Kevin's voice coming from the direction we descended from the canyon, but we'd all seen Kevin Thing disappear over the canyon rim hours ago. "Kevin?" Jennifer called back uncertainly. "Yeah, it's me. I found a stream about a quarter-mile back. We can refill our bottles." David grabbed a burning branch from the fire and held it up like a torch. "Kevin, come into the light so we can see you." "Why? It's just me. Come on, we need to get water before it gets too dark." The voice was perfect, exactly matching Kevin's tone and inflection, but it was coming from a location we knew he couldn't have reached by any normal means. "Kevin," Sarah called out, "what's your daughter's favorite movie?" A long pause. "What? Why are you asking that?" "Just answer the question." She likes lots of movies. Kid movies." Sarah looked at us meaningfully. Kevin's daughter was obsessed with Finding Nemo and watched it almost daily. He'd complained about it constantly during lunch breaks. "That's not Kevin," David said firmly. The voice from the darkness changed, becoming lower and more menacing. "Come down to the water. You must be thirsty." We heard movement in the rocks below us, but it sounded like more than one person now. Multiple sets of footsteps circling our position. Then the singing started again. But this time, the voices were definitely human and coming from different directions. David threw the burning branch into the darkness. It illuminated a brief glimpse of figures moving among the rocks. People in tattered clothing, moving with the same unnatural grace we'd seen from Kevin Thing. "How many of them are there?" Jennifer whispered. "Too many," David replied. The singing grew louder, and we could hear them climbing up toward our campsite. David kicked dirt over our fire, plunging us into darkness. "Stay together," he whispered. "Move toward the tree line." We grabbed our essential gear and began a careful retreat from our campsite. Behind us, we could hear the creatures reaching our abandoned camp. They spoke to each other in voices that sounded almost human, but carried an undertone that made my skin crawl. "They were here recently," one said in Kevin's voice. "Still warm," another replied, though I didn't recognize this voice. "They can't have gone far. said a third, and this one sounded like Jennifer. I looked at Jennifer beside me to make sure she hadn't spoken. She was staring back toward the camp with wide, terrified eyes. We reached the edge of a pine forest and took shelter among the trees. From there, we could see dark shapes moving around our abandoned campsite, searching for signs of our passage. They moved wrong. Too fluid, joints bending in directions human joints shouldn't bend. "We need to keep moving," David whispered. "Put distance between us and them." We spent the night stumbling through the forest in darkness, afraid to use our flashlights and give away our position. Several times we heard the creatures calling out in our voices, trying to lure us back. They had our speech patterns perfect, but there was always something slightly off. Words emphasized wrong, emotions that didn't match the content. Dawn found us exhausted and lost again, but apparently alone. We'd reached higher elevation during our night retreat, and the forest here was thicker, providing better concealment. David suggested we rest for a few hours before continuing. I volunteered for first watch while the others slept. Sitting against a large pine tree, I tried to process what had happened to us. 3 days ago, we'd been normal office workers on a simple hiking trip. Now, we were fugitives from something that could wear human faces and voices like costumes. About an hour into my watch, I noticed movement in the trees ahead of me. A figure was approaching through the forest, moving carefully between the pine trunks. As it got closer, I realized with horror that it was me, or something wearing my exact appearance. The false Michael moved with my mannerisms, dressed in identical hiking gear, even carried the same scratches and dirt stains I'd accumulated over the past few days. It stopped about 30 yards away and smiled at me with my own face. "Hello, Michael," it said in my voice. "Quite an adventure we're having." I didn't dare respond or move. The others were sleeping nearby, and any sound might alert them to danger, or let the creature know where they were. "Your friends are wondering where you went," the false Michael continued. "They're getting worried. Maybe you should go back to them." It was trying to trick me into believing I was the imposter, that I'd wandered away from my group and was now confused. The psychological manipulation was sophisticated and almost worked. For a moment, I doubted my own memories. The false Michael took a step closer. "Come on, Michael. Let's go back together. They're waiting for us." That's when I noticed the eyes were wrong, just like they'd been with Kevin Thing. Too large, too reflective, with that same greenish tint. I quietly reached for a rock beside me and threw it as hard as I could at the creature. It struck the false Michael in the chest, and for just an instant, its appearance flickered like a broken television signal. I caught a glimpse of something else underneath, something tall and emaciated with gray skin and too many teeth. The false Michael hissed and backed away into the trees. "You can't run forever," it said, but the voice was no longer mine. It had become something else entirely, harsh and guttural, like grinding stone. I woke the others immediately and told them what had happened. David's face went pale when I described seeing myself. "They're getting better at it," he said, "learning from us." "Learning what?" Sarah asked. "How to be human." We broke camp quickly and continued deeper into the forest. The trees provided cover, but they also limited our visibility and gave the creatures more places to hide. We kept hearing voices calling our names from different directions, but we'd learned not to trust any sound in these mountains. By afternoon, we reached a clearing where we could see more of the surrounding landscape. David studied his compass and map, trying to determine our location. "I think we're north of where we started," he said. "If we head southeast, we should eventually hit the Apache Trail or one of the other roads." But Jennifer was pointing toward the far side of the clearing. "Look." On the opposite tree line, figures stood watching us. From this distance, they looked like normal people, but we'd learned not to trust appearances. As we watched, more figures emerged from the forest until there were at least a dozen of them, all standing perfectly still and facing our direction. "They're surrounding us," Sarah said. David looked around the clearing and confirmed her assessment. Figures had appeared at multiple points along the tree line, cutting off our retreat routes. We were trapped in the open ground with nowhere to run. "What do they want?" Jennifer asked. "I think they want to replace us," David replied. "All of us." The figures began moving into the clearing, walking with that same unnatural grace we'd seen before. As they got closer, I could see that some of them were wearing the faces of people I didn't recognize, probably other hikers who'd disappeared in these mountains over the years. But leading the group was Kevin Thing, still wearing our friend's appearance. It smiled when it saw us watching. "You can't keep running," it said in Kevin's voice. "This is our territory. You're just visitors here." "What did you do with Kevin?" David shouted back. "Kevin is still here," the creature replied, touching its chest. "He's part of us now, just like you'll be." More creatures emerged from the forest, and I realized we were facing at least 20 of them. Some wore human faces, others appeared as tall, emaciated figures with gray skin and elongated limbs. Their hands ended in claws, and their mouths were filled with too many sharp teeth. "The Navajo have stories about us," Kevin Thing continued as the creatures closed in. "They call us skinwalkers, but that's not quite right. We're older than their stories, older than their people. We've been in these mountains since before humans walked here." David pulled out his pocket knife, a pathetic weapon against so many creatures. "Stay together," he told us. "Don't let them separate us." The creatures began to circle us, moving in a coordinated pattern like pack hunters. They were taking their time, savoring our fear. "We don't kill you," Kevin Thing explained. "That would be wasteful. We absorb you, take your memories, your mannerisms, your entire identity. Then we use your form to hunt others. It's quite efficient." "You're parasites," Sarah spat. "We're survivors," Kevin Thing corrected. "Just like you. The only difference is, we're better at it." The circle was tightening. In minutes, they'd be close enough to reach us. I looked around desperately for any means of escape, but we were completely surrounded in open ground. That's when I remembered the flare gun in David's pack. He'd brought it for emergencies, and this definitely qualified. I grabbed his pack and started digging through it frantically. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Emergency signal," I replied, pulling out the flare gun and a handful of cartridges. The creatures paused when they saw the weapon. Kevin Thing tilted its head curiously. "That won't hurt us," it said. "Maybe not," I replied, "but it might hurt the forest." The desert had been dry for weeks, and these pine trees would go up like kindling. I aimed the flare gun at the nearest tree line and fired. The flare struck a dead branch and immediately ignited it. Flames spread rapidly through the dry needles and jumped to neighboring trees. The creatures reacted with alarm, backing away from the growing fire. Kevin Thing snarled at me. "You'll burn yourselves too." "Better than becoming like you," I said, loading another flare. The fire was spreading quickly, driven by the dry conditions and afternoon wind. Within minutes, a significant portion of the forest was ablaze, creating a wall of flame between us and some of the creatures. "Run!" David shouted. We sprinted toward the gap in their circle created by the fire. Several creatures tried to intercept us, but they seemed reluctant to get too close to the flames. David swung his knife at one that got too near, opening a gash in its gray flesh that leaked black fluid instead of blood. We broke through their line and ran into the burning forest. The heat was intense, and smoke filled our lungs, but it was better than being captured by those things. Behind us, we could hear the creatures shrieking in frustration and pain. The forest fire we'd started was growing into a major blaze, consuming acres of dry timber. We ran ahead of the flames, staying just far enough ahead to avoid being caught but close enough to benefit from the barrier they created between us and our pursuers. For over an hour, we ran through the mountains with a wall of fire at our backs. The smoke provided cover, but it also made breathing difficult and navigation nearly impossible. We stumbled through the wilderness, guided only by the need to stay ahead of the flames. Eventually, we emerged from the forest onto a rocky slope where the fire couldn't follow. From this vantage point, we could see the massive blaze we'd started, sending a column of smoke thousands of feet into the air. We could also see roads in the distance, the first sign of civilization we'd encountered in days. "Forest Service will be responding to that fire," David said between gasps for air. "Search and rescue, too, probably." "Good," Sarah replied. "I want to get as far away from here as possible." We made our way down the rocky slope toward the nearest road, a journey that took another 2 hours. By the time we reached the pavement, we could hear helicopters overhead and see emergency vehicles in the distance. A park ranger picked us up within minutes of reaching the road. We told him we'd been lost in the forest and had seen the fire start, but we didn't mention the creatures. Who would have believed us? At the hospital, we were treated for smoke inhalation and dehydration. The authorities questioned us about the fire, and we maintained our story about being lost hikers who'd witnessed the blaze but hadn't caused it. Environmental investigators would later determine that the fire started from an unknown ignition source, possibly lightning or a cigarette. Kevin was officially listed as missing, and search teams spent weeks looking for him in the burned areas. They never found any trace of him. The fire consumed over 10,000 acres before being contained. Investigators found some disturbing evidence in the burn zone: human remains that couldn't be identified, strange pictographs carved into rocks, and what appeared to be primitive shelters built from bones and hide. They also found remnants of camping equipment from dozens of missing persons cases dating back years. The official explanation was that the area had been used as a dumping ground by someone who'd been killing hikers, though no suspect was ever identified. Sarah, Jennifer, David, and I all left Morrison & Associates within a month of returning. We stayed in touch at first, but gradually drifted apart. None of us wanted to talk about what had really happened in the Superstition Mountains. The memories were too vivid, too terrifying. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear that wordless singing, and sometimes when I'm walking alone, I catch glimpses of familiar faces in crowds, faces that should belong to people I know, but wearing expressions that are just slightly wrong. I've learned to avoid remote places, especially areas with missing person reports, because I know now that there are things in the wilderness that are older and more dangerous than any natural predator. Things that can wear human faces and voices like costumes, hunting for new identities to steal. The official reports say Kevin died in a hiking accident, his body lost to the forest fire. But I know better. Kevin is still out there somewhere, along with all the other people who've disappeared in those mountains over the years. They're part of something larger now. Something that has been hunting in the wilderness since before recorded history. And sometimes, on quiet nights, I wonder if they're still hunting, if they've moved to new territories, new hunting grounds, if the fire we started just scattered them rather than destroying them. Because the last thing I remember before we reached the road was looking back at the smoke-filled forest and seeing a familiar figure standing on a distant ridge, watching us leave. It was Kevin, or something wearing his face, and it was smiling. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the Superstition Mountains of Arizona, in a place where the desert meets jagged peaks and ancient legends still whisper through the wind. I should have listened to the warnings. The old Pima man at the gas station in Apache Junction had looked at my camping gear with eyes that held too much knowledge. "Superstitions ain't no place for white men to be wandering alone," he'd said, his weathered fingers drumming against the counter. "Especially not during the new moon." But I was running from something worse than desert legends. 3 months earlier, my wife Sarah had died in a car accident. My fault, according to the guilt that gnawed at my insides like a living thing. The therapist said I needed to process my grief, but all I wanted was silence. The kind of silence you can only find in places where civilization fears to tread. Rex, my golden retriever, seemed excited about the adventure as we loaded the Jeep. At least one of us was optimistic. He'd been Sarah's dog originally, and after she died, he'd become my constant shadow, as if sensing that I might disappear too if left unwatched. His enthusiasm was infectious, and for the first time in months, I felt something approaching hope. The drive from Phoenix took 3 hours, winding through increasingly desolate terrain. The Superstition Mountains rose before us like the backbone of some prehistoric beast, all red rock and impossible angles. The locals called them cursed, said they were home to the lost Dutchman's gold mine, and things far worse than human greed. I'd planned a 5-day solo camping trip in the wilderness area near Weaver's Needle, far from established trails and further from the tourists who flocked to the easier hikes. My backpack was loaded with enough supplies for a week, plus emergency rations. Rex had his own pack with food and water. We were prepared for everything except what we actually found. The first sign something was wrong came as we hiked toward my chosen campsite. Rex, who normally bounded ahead with eager curiosity, began walking closer to my legs. His ears were pinned back, and every few minutes he'd stop and stare into the desert scrub with a low whine building in his throat. "What is it, boy?" I asked, following his gaze. Nothing but saguaro cacti and creosote bushes, their shadows growing long in the afternoon sun. But the silence was wrong somehow. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals, not even the buzz of insects. The desert felt empty. We reached my intended campsite just as the sun touched the mountain peaks. It was a small clearing surrounded by Palo Verde trees, with good visibility in all directions and access to a seasonal stream that still held water from the winter rains. Perfect, except for the smell. It hit me as soon as I dropped my pack. Something sickly sweet, like overripe fruit mixed with copper pennies. Rex immediately began pacing the perimeter of the clearing, his hackles raised. Probably just a dead javelina, I told myself, though I couldn't see any carcass. The smell seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, carried on a wind that touched my skin like cold fingers despite the desert heat. I set up camp anyway. What choice did I have? The nearest established campground was a 4-hour hike back, and darkness was coming fast. As I pitched my tent, I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than necessary. The feeling of being watched was so strong it made my skin crawl, but every time I turned around, there was nothing but rocks and dying light. Rex refused to eat his dinner. He sat beside my camp chair, trembling slightly, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond our small circle of lamplight. I tried to coax him with treats, but he wouldn't even sniff them. When a dog that once ate an entire birthday cake won't touch food, you know something's seriously wrong. "It's okay, buddy," I said, running my fingers through his fur. But it wasn't okay. Nothing about this place was okay. The temperature dropped with the sun, which was normal for desert nights. What wasn't normal was how the cold seemed to seep into my bones, making me shiver despite my thermal layers. I built up the fire, feeding it with deadwood I'd gathered earlier, but the flames seemed reluctant to catch. When they finally did, they burned with an odd blue tinge that cast strange shadows on the surrounding rocks. That's when I heard the first sound. It came from somewhere beyond the firelight, a soft scratching, like fingernails dragging across stone. Rex's ears shot up, and he released a low growl that raised the hair on my arms. The sound stopped abruptly, as if whatever was making it knew we were listening. I grabbed my flashlight and swept the beam across the clearing's perimeter. Nothing moved in the white circle of light, but I had the distinct impression that something had just stepped out of view. The feeling was so strong that I stood up, Rex pressed against my legs. "Hello?" I called out, immediately feeling foolish. "Is someone there?" My voice echoed off the canyon walls and died into silence. But in that silence, I swear I heard something else. A soft exhalation like someone letting out a held breath. It came from directly behind me. I spun around, heart hammering, but found only my tent and the dying fire. Rex was now whimpering continuously, a sound I'd never heard him make before. He was staring at something beyond my left shoulder, his entire body rigid with terror. I turned slowly, following his gaze, and that's when I saw them. Eyes. Two pale, reflective orbs floating about 8 feet off the ground, just at the edge of my vision. When I tried to look directly at them, they seemed to shift and blur, like trying to focus on something in peripheral vision. But they were there, watching us with an intelligence that felt ancient and hungry. "Jesus," I whispered, fumbling for the can of bear spray on my belt. The eyes didn't move, didn't blink, just continued their patient observation. Rex was now pressed so tightly against my legs that I could feel him shaking. I aimed my flashlight at the eyes, but the beam passed right through them as if they weren't there. Yet I could still see them, pale and luminous in the darkness. My rational mind tried to explain it away. Desert foxes with reflective eyes, a trick of firelight and shadows. But every primitive instinct I possessed was screaming danger. The scratching sound came again, closer this time, and now it was accompanied by something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, circling our camp just beyond the reach of light. But these weren't normal footsteps. They had an odd quality, like bare feet on stone, but with too many impacts. As if whatever was walking had more than 2 legs. "We're leaving," I said to Rex, though my voice came out as a croak. "Right now." But as I turned to grab my pack, I realized the footsteps had stopped. The eyes were gone. The desert had returned to its unnatural silence, broken only by Rex's panicked breathing and the crackle of the fire. I spent the next hour breaking camp in record time, stuffing gear into my pack without regard for organization. Rex stayed glued to my side, occasionally letting out little whines when a shadow moved wrong or the fire popped too loudly. Every instinct told me to run. But where? We were miles from the nearest road, and stumbling through the desert in darkness would be suicide. By the time I had everything packed, exhaustion was hitting me like a physical weight. I hadn't slept properly in weeks, and the adrenaline crash was making it hard to think clearly. Rex was already curled up as close to the fire as he could get without singeing his fur, and his eyelids were drooping despite his obvious anxiety. Maybe we just wait for dawn, I told myself. Keep the fire burning, take turns keeping watch. It was a mistake that nearly cost us everything. I must have dozed off in my camp chair because the next thing I knew, Rex was barking frantically. Not his normal bark, but something high-pitched and desperate, almost like screaming. I jerked awake to find the fire reduced to glowing embers and the desert shrouded in complete darkness. Rex was backing toward me, his bark becoming increasingly frantic. In the dim, red glow of the coals, I could see his hackles standing straight up, making him look twice his normal size. He was facing something in the darkness, something I couldn't see but could feel pressing against the edges of our small circle of safety. I grabbed my flashlight and clicked it on. The beam illuminated Rex first, and my blood went cold. His eyes were no longer brown but completely white, rolled back so far that only the whites showed. Foam was gathering at the corners of his mouth, and his body was rigid with terror so complete it had driven him nearly catatonic. "Rex," I called, but he didn't respond, didn't even twitch. He just kept backing toward me with that horrible mechanical precision, never taking his unseeing eyes off whatever lurked in the darkness ahead. I swung the flashlight beam beyond him and immediately wished I hadn't. The thing standing at the edge of our camp barely looked human. It was tall, maybe 7 feet, with limbs that seemed too long and bent at wrong angles. Its skin was the color of old leather, stretched tight over bones that jutted out in places bones shouldn't be. But it was the face that made my sanity slip a little. It was my face. Not quite, but close enough to send ice through my veins. Like someone had taken my features and stretched them, elongated them, twisted them into something that wore my appearance like an ill-fitting mask. The eyes were the worst part. My eyes, but filled with a predatory intelligence that had never been human. The thing wearing my face smiled with teeth that were too sharp and too numerous. When it spoke, the voice was mine, but wrong. Hollow, like an echo of an echo. "Hello, Michael," it said, and hearing my own voice speak those words nearly broke my mind. "I've been waiting for you." Rex's barking cut off abruptly. Not gradually, not fading. It just stopped, like someone had flipped a switch. When I looked down, he was gone. Not fled, not hiding. Gone, as if he'd never been there at all. "Where's my dog?" I demanded, surprised that my voice worked at all. The thing tilted its head, my head, with curious interest. "Dog? What dog, Michael? You came here alone. You've always been alone." The wrongness of that statement hit me like a physical blow. Of course, Rex was here. He'd been with me the entire trip. I had clear memories of him eating from his bowl just hours ago, of his warm weight against my legs as we'd faced down those floating eyes. But as I tried to focus on those memories, they became slippery, uncertain. Had there been a dog? Or was that something I'd imagined? A projection of my grief-addled mind? "No," I said firmly. "Rex was here. My dog. He was here." The thing that wore my face laughed, and the sound was like glass breaking in my skull. Poor Michael. Still talking to things that aren't there. Still blaming yourself for things you couldn't control. Still running from the truth. What truth? The words came out as a whisper. That you killed her. That it wasn't an accident. That you turned the wheel on purpose. The lie hit me like a punch to the gut. Except it wasn't a lie. Not entirely. In the microsecond before impact, when I'd seen the truck running the red light, there had been a choice. Swerve left and hit the median, possibly surviving, or swerve right into the truck's path and guarantee Sarah would take the worst of it. I'd chosen right, and in that split second of cowardice, I'd murdered my wife. "You remember now," the thing said, its voice taking on a satisfied tone. "You remember choosing to save yourself, choosing to let her die." "Stop," I choked out, but the memories were flooding back with crystalline clarity. The moment of decision, the impact. Sarah's scream cutting off mid-breath, the silence that followed. "You came here to die," the thing continued, stepping closer. Its movements were fluid but wrong, like it was walking on joints that bent both ways. "You came here to feed yourself to the desert, to finally pay for what you did. But death is too easy, Michael, too clean." I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't obey. The flashlight beam was growing dim, the batteries dying at the worst possible moment. In the fading light, I could see the thing's features becoming more distorted, more openly inhuman. "I have a better idea," it said. "I'll take your place. Live your life. Feel what it's like to be human, to have human desires and fears and guilt, and you can have mine." The change began in my hands. I watched in horror as my fingers started to elongate, the nails growing sharp and black. The pain was indescribable. Like every bone in my body was breaking and reforming. I tried to scream, but the sound that came out was no longer recognizably human. But then something warm pressed against my leg. I looked down and saw Rex, solid and real, growling at the creature that wore my face. His eyes were brown again, clear and focused, and in them I saw something that cut through the thing's mental assault like a blade. Love. Unconditional, uncomplicated love. The kind Sarah had tried to show me, that I'd been too damaged to accept. "You're not real," I told the thing, and for the first time since this nightmare began, my voice was steady. "You're just my guilt given form, my self-hatred made manifest." The creature's stolen features twisted with rage. "I am real. I am the darkness that lives in every human heart, the voice that whispers in the small hours that you're worthless, that you deserve to suffer." "Maybe," I said, reaching down to touch Rex's head. His fur was warm and real under my fingers, an anchor to sanity. "But guilt isn't the only thing that lives in the human heart." The thing lunged at me with a shriek that shattered the desert silence, but this time I was ready. As its claws reached for my throat, I stepped aside and grabbed the burning branch I'd prepared while it had been gloating. The flames were no longer blue, but bright orange-red, fed by my newfound certainty. The fire touched its stolen skin, and the creature's scream became something beyond sound, beyond human perception. It writhed and twisted, its form shifting between my face and something ancient and terrible. But it didn't die. Things like this don't die easy. Instead, it retreated, flowing backward into the darkness like smoke. But before it disappeared entirely, it spoke one last time. "I'll be back, Michael. Every time you close your eyes, every time you remember what you did, I'll be there. You can't run from yourself forever." And then it was gone, leaving only the smell of sulfur and the echo of my own rapid breathing. Rex was still pressed against my leg, solid and warm and undeniably real. As dawn began to creep over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I realized something had changed inside me. The guilt was still there. It always would be, but it no longer had complete control. I'd made a terrible choice in a moment of fear. I'd failed Sarah in the worst possible way, but I was still alive, and that meant I still had choices to make. I could let the darkness consume me, or I could try to do better. Be better. For Sarah's memory. For Rex, who'd somehow found his way back to me when I needed him most. For myself. We broke camp as the sun rose, and I made a decision. Instead of the 5-day isolation I'd planned, we were going home. There were things I needed to do, people I needed to make amends with, a life I needed to try to rebuild. But as we hiked back toward the Jeep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us. Not the creature. That had been banished, at least for now. This was something else, something that moved just outside my peripheral vision and left no tracks in the desert sand. Every time I turned around, there was nothing there. But Rex's ears would prick up, and he'd look back with what almost seemed like recognition, like he could see whatever it was that I couldn't. It wasn't until we reached the parking area that I figured out what it was. As I loaded our gear into the Jeep, Rex suddenly bounded forward with a happy bark, tail wagging frantically. He was greeting someone, jumping up to put his paws on their chest in the way he'd always done with Sarah. But there was no one there, just empty air and desert wind. And then I felt it. A touch so light it might have been imagination, warm fingers brushing my cheek. The touch was accompanied by a scent I knew better than my own name, vanilla and jasmine, Sarah's perfume. I stood there in the parking lot, tears streaming down my face, as Rex continued to play with someone I couldn't see. Because I understood, finally, that some things don't leave us when they die. Some things stay, not as guilt or regret, but as love, as forgiveness. The creature in the desert had been right about one thing. I'd come there to die, but death had found me anyway, in a way I'd never expected. The death of the man who'd lived in constant self-recrimination, who'd believed himself beyond redemption. In his place was someone who had a chance to do better, to honor the memory of a woman who'd loved him despite his flaws, who'd forgiven him before he'd even learned to forgive himself. Rex jumped into the Jeep with his usual enthusiasm, but he kept looking back at that empty space where he'd sensed Sarah's presence. His tail was still wagging, and for the first time in months, I found myself smiling. "Come on, boy," I said, starting the engine. "Let's go home." As we drove away from the Superstition Mountains, I could see them in the rearview mirror, red rocks glowing in the morning sun. They looked beautiful now, majestic rather than threatening. The desert had shown me my demons, forced me to face them, and somehow that confrontation had saved rather than damned me. But I also knew the creature hadn't been lying when it promised to return. Guilt and self-hatred don't disappear overnight, and there would be dark moments ahead when its voice would whisper in my ear, telling me I was worthless, that I deserved to suffer. The difference now was that I wouldn't be facing those moments alone. I had Rex, who somehow always knew when I needed comfort. I had the memory of Sarah's touch, the knowledge that she'd forgiven me even if I was still learning to forgive myself. And I had something else. A purpose. Sarah had always wanted to volunteer at the animal shelter, but we'd never found the time. Maybe I could find the time now? Maybe I could help other lost souls, human and canine alike, find their way back to something like happiness. The road stretched out ahead of us, leading back toward Phoenix and whatever came next. In the passenger seat, Rex was already dozing, confident that wherever we were going together. His trust was a gift I didn't deserve, but one I was determined to earn. As we crested the last hill before the highway, I caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror. Something pale and elongated, standing in the road behind us. But when I looked again, it was gone, dismissed by sunlight and determination and the simple act of moving forward. The Superstition Mountains held their secrets close, and I suspected they always would. But I'd taken something from them too, the knowledge that even in the deepest darkness, love endures, that forgiveness is possible, even for those who believe themselves unforgivable. It would have to be enough. The miles rolled by beneath our wheels, carrying us toward home and whatever healing waited there. And for the first time since Sarah's death, I felt something that might eventually grow into peace. Behind us, the desert wind whispered through the canyon walls, carrying the scent of sage and possibility. And somewhere in that wind, I swear I could hear laughter. Sarah's laughter, free and joyful and alive with love. Rex stirred in his sleep and let out a contented sigh. In the growing warmth of the day, the horror of the night before seemed almost like a dream. Almost. But the scar on my hand where the creature's claws had raked across my skin was real enough, and it would serve as a permanent reminder that some journeys into darkness are necessary. That sometimes, to find the light, you first have to face the monsters that live in your own heart. The highway stretched out ahead, leading us home. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 28 years old. This happened in the Superstition Mountains of Arizona, about 40 miles east of Phoenix, in a place where the desert meets jagged volcanic peaks and ancient Apache legends still whisper through the wind. It was supposed to be a simple 3-day camping trip. Just me, David Jones, and Christopher Hernandez, 3 friends from college trying to recapture some sense of adventure before our 30s swallowed us whole. We'd been planning it for months, researching trails and camping spots in the Superstition Wilderness area. David, always the planner, had found what he called the perfect spot, a secluded canyon near Weaver's Needle, far from the day hikers and weekend warriors. "Trust me," David had said, spreading topographical maps across my kitchen table weeks earlier. "This place is untouched. No cell towers, no other campers, just us in the desert." Christopher had laughed, running his fingers through his dark hair. "Sounds like the beginning of a horror movie, man." How prophetic those words would prove to be. We started our hike Friday morning, the October sun already promising another scorching day despite the early hour. The trailhead at Peralta was busy with other hikers, but as we ventured deeper into the wilderness, following David's carefully plotted route, the crowds thinned until we were alone with the towering saguaros and the ever-present buzz of insects. The first sign something was wrong came around noon, when we stopped to check our GPS coordinates. David pulled out his phone, frowning at the screen. "That's weird," he muttered. "The GPS is showing us about a mile off from where we should be." I checked my own phone. Same result. Christopher's too. "Maybe it's the mountains," Christopher suggested, wiping sweat from his forehead, interfering with the signal. David nodded, but I could see the worry creeping into his eyes. He'd spent weeks planning this route, memorizing every landmark. He wasn't the type to make navigation errors. We pressed on, following what David insisted was the correct trail despite what our devices were telling us. The landscape grew more desolate as we climbed higher, the familiar desert flora giving way to stranger formations of rock and scrub. The silence was oppressive. No bird calls, no rustle of small animals. Even the ever-present buzz of insects had faded to nothing. "It's too quiet," Christopher said, voicing what we were all thinking. David stopped abruptly, consulting his paper map. "This can't be right," he said. "According to this, we should have hit the creek bed 20 minutes ago." I looked around at the barren landscape surrounding us. No creek, no water anywhere. just endless red rock and dying vegetation under a sky that seemed too vast and too empty. "Maybe we took a wrong turn somewhere," I suggested. David's jaw tightened. "I don't take wrong turns." We backtracked for an hour, but nothing looked familiar. It was as if the landscape itself had shifted while we weren't looking. The trail markers that David swore had been there earlier were nowhere to be found. Worse, the path we'd been following seemed to have vanished entirely, leaving us standing in a maze of identical-looking washes and rocky outcroppings. By late afternoon, we were thoroughly lost. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. We finally admitted defeat and made camp in a small clearing surrounded by towering red cliffs, hoping that morning would bring clarity. As Christopher and I set up the tents, David tried repeatedly to get a signal on his phone, walking in widening circles around our campsite. His frustration was palpable. "This is impossible," he kept muttering. "The GPS worked fine when we tested it last week." That night, as we sat around our small campfire, the flames seemed to flicker wrong, not dancing in the breeze but writhing like living things in perfectly still air. The fire refused to burn properly, guttering low despite our constant feeding of dry wood, casting weak, shifting light that created more shadows than illumination. "Anyone else notice how quiet it is out here?" Christopher asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. In all my years of camping, I'd never experienced such complete silence. No coyote calls, no owl hoots, no scurrying of nocturnal creatures. It was as if we'd stumbled into a dead zone where nothing lived. David poked at the fire with a stick, sending up a shower of sparks that died before reaching knee-height. "My grandfather used to tell stories about places like this," he said, "places where the spirits are restless." "Your grandfather was Navajo, right?" Christopher asked. David nodded. "He always said there were parts of the desert that belonged to the old things, places where humans weren't meant to walk." A chill ran down my spine that had nothing to do with the desert night air. "You think we're in one of those places?" David's eyes reflected the firelight, but something else seemed to move behind them, something that made me want to look away. "I think we need to be very careful out here." We took turns keeping watch that night, though none of us slept well. During my shift, sometime around 3 a.m., I could swear I heard footsteps circling our camp. Slow, deliberate steps that stopped whenever I turned toward the sound. The fire continued to burn strangely, occasionally flaring green or blue for no apparent reason. When morning came, we discovered that our water supply had gone bad overnight. All of it. 3 sealed bottles that had been perfectly fine the day before now contained a brackish, foul-smelling liquid that made us gag just to smell it. Our food wasn't much better. The sealed packages of trail mix and energy bars had somehow become infested with maggots. "This is impossible," David said, staring at the ruined supplies. These were sealed packages. Christopher held up an energy bar that writhed with white larvae. "Maybe we should head back." But when we looked for the way we'd come, we found that our footprints from the previous day had vanished, not weathered away or covered by wind, simply gone, as if we'd never passed that way at all. The landscape looked different too, subtly wrong in ways I couldn't quite identify. "We keep going," David said, his voice strange and flat. "The planned route. We stick to the planned route." I studied his face. Something was off about his expression. Too calm, too determined considering our situation. "David, maybe we should—" "We stick to the plan," he repeated, and when he smiled it lasted just a beat too long. We broke camp and continued deeper into the wilderness, following David's lead even though none of us recognized the terrain anymore. The desert around us seemed to shift and change when we weren't looking directly at it. Rocks that had been on our left would suddenly appear on our right. The path would split and merge in ways that defied the topography. Around midday, we stopped to rest in the shade of a massive boulder that cast a shadow far larger than it should have. David announced he was going to scout ahead for water. "I'll be back in an hour," he said, shouldering his pack. "Don't wander off." He walked away with that same strange, too calm expression, and I watched until he disappeared around a bend in the canyon. Christopher and I waited in uncomfortable silence, both of us sensing that something fundamental had changed but unable to articulate what. An hour passed. Then 2. The sun continued its relentless journey across the sky, and still no sign of David. "We should go look for him," Christopher said, but neither of us moved. Some primal instinct kept us rooted to our spot in the shade. It was nearly sunset when David finally returned, emerging from the same direction he'd left. But something was wrong. Terribly wrong. He walked too smoothly, his gait just slightly off as if he'd forgotten how his own legs worked. His clothes were exactly as clean as when he'd left, despite a full day in the dusty desert. And his eyes seemed to focus on points just slightly to the left or right of whatever he was looking at. "Find any water?" Christopher asked. David turned toward him with that same too long smile. "Yes," he said. "Lots of water. Very close now." But his voice was wrong. The cadence was off, like someone doing an imperfect impression of David's speech patterns. And there was something else, an underlying sound, almost like an echo, as if multiple voices were speaking in unison. That night, as we sat around another guttering fire, I watched David carefully. He didn't eat, claiming he'd found berries while scouting. He didn't drink from our limited water supply, and every few minutes when he thought we weren't looking, he would turn his head at an impossible angle, as if listening to something only he could hear. Christopher caught my eye across the fire and nodded almost imperceptibly. He'd noticed too. "David," I said carefully, "what kind of berries did you find?" He blinked slowly, like an owl. "Red ones." "What did they taste like?" Another long blink. "Sweet." But there were no red berries in this part of the desert. I knew because I'd been looking for edible plants all day. "Can you show us where you found them tomorrow?" Christopher asked. David's head swiveled toward him with unnatural smoothness. Tomorrow, we reached the water. That night, I lay in my sleeping bag listening to David's breathing from the tent next to mine. Except it wasn't quite breathing. It was too regular, too mechanical, like the sound of bellows rather than lungs. And occasionally, I could swear I heard other sounds coming from his tent. Whispers in a language I didn't recognize. The sound of something moving that was too large to be David. Christopher and I had agreed to take watches again, but when I woke for my shift, I found him sitting bolt upright in his sleeping bag, staring at David's tent with wide, terrified eyes. "He's been talking," Christopher whispered, "all night, but not in English." I listened and heard the strange whispers continuing, a rhythmic chanting that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "That's not David," Christopher said, and I knew he was right. Whatever had come back to our camp was wearing David's face, but it wasn't him. The real David, my friend who obsessed over trail maps and always packed extra batteries, was gone. When morning came, the thing that looked like David emerged from its tent with that same unnatural smile. Its clothes were pristine, despite sleeping in the dirt. Its hair was perfectly neat, and when it spoke, that echoing quality in its voice was more pronounced. "Today, we reach the water," it announced, "and then you'll understand." Christopher and I exchanged glances. We had to get away from this thing, but we were lost in the middle of the wilderness with no supplies and no idea which direction led home. "Lead the way," I said, hoping my voice sounded normal. We followed the David thing deeper into the canyon, through landscape that became increasingly alien. The rock formations twisted into impossible shapes. The few plants we encountered were species I'd never seen before. Gnarled, colorless things that seemed to lean away from us as we passed. And always, the silence. The oppressive, unnatural silence that pressed down on us like a physical weight. Around noon, we reached a small pool of water nestled between two towering red walls. The water was perfectly clear, perfectly still, and perfectly wrong. It reflected nothing. Not the sky, Not the rocks, not us. Looking into it was like staring into a void. "Drink," the David thing said, and for the first time I heard the command in its voice. Not a suggestion. An order. Christopher backed away from the pool. "I'm not thirsty." The thing that wore David's face turned toward him, and I saw its features shift slightly as if the mask was slipping. For just a moment, I glimpsed something else underneath. Something with too many teeth and eyes that reflected light like an animal's. "Drink," it repeated, and this time there was no mistaking the threat. I realized then what was happening. This wasn't just about getting us lost or stealing David's appearance. This thing wanted something from us. It wanted us to drink from that void pool, and I had a terrible feeling I knew why. "Where's David?" I asked. The real David. The thing's smile widened impossibly, stretching its stolen features into a grotesque parody of human expression. "David is here," it said, and touched its chest. "David is always here now." Christopher let out a strangled cry and stumbled backward, tripping over a rock. The thing that looked like David moved toward him with that same unnatural grace, no longer bothering to maintain the pretense of humanity. That's when I saw them. Dozens of other figures emerging from behind rocks and from crevices in the canyon walls. They all looked human at first glance, but wrong in the same subtle ways. A woman whose neck bent at the wrong angle. A man whose shadow fell in the opposite direction from the sun. A child whose feet didn't quite touch the ground. "The water calls to you," the David thing said, its voice now a chorus of stolen voices. As it called to us, as it called to him. I understood then. This pool wasn't just water, it was a trap, a collecting point for something ancient and hungry. These weren't just shapeshifters or spirits. They were people who had been consumed, their forms stolen and their souls trapped inside these hollow mockeries. The real David was in there somewhere, imprisoned in his own stolen body, watching helplessly as this thing used his face to lure his friends to the same fate. Christopher was backing toward the pool, the ring of false humans closing in around us. In desperation, I grabbed a rock and hurled it at the David thing's head. The rock passed right through it. The thing laughed, a sound like wind through broken glass. "You cannot hurt what is not truly there," it said, "but we can hurt you. Oh yes, we can make you hurt until you beg for the water's embrace." The other figures began to close in, their movements becoming less human with each step. I saw claws where there should have been fingers, joints bending in impossible directions, faces that shifted and flowed like liquid. But then I remembered something David's grandfather had told us around campfires when we were kids. Iron. These things, whatever they were, couldn't stand the touch of iron. I fumbled in my pack for my camping knife. Cheap steel, but it might work. As the David thing reached for me with hands that now ended in black talons, I slashed wildly with the blade. The thing shrieked and recoiled, its stolen face melting like wax. Where the knife had passed, its form wavered and became translucent. "Iron!" I shouted to Christopher. "They can't touch iron!" Christopher pulled out his own knife, and together we fought our way through the circle of false humans. They hissed and spat and clawed at us, but they couldn't maintain their forms when the steel touched them. We ran. Through the canyon, over rocks, through thorny desert scrub that tore at our clothes and skin. Behind us, the inhuman screams echoed off the canyon walls, and I could hear the sound of pursuit. Not footsteps, but something like wind carrying whispers and the scrape of claws on stone. I don't know how long we ran or how we found our way out of that maze of twisted canyons. Time seemed to flow differently there, the sun hanging motionless in the sky like a painted backdrop. But eventually, impossibly, we stumbled onto a marked trail. A real trail, with real footprints from real hikers. We flagged down a park ranger at the Peralta trailhead 3 hours later, babbling about being lost and our friend disappearing. They organized a search party, brought in helicopters, searched for days. They never found David Jones. According to the official report, he simply vanished without a trace in the Superstition Wilderness, another casualty of the unforgiving desert. But Christopher and I know the truth. David didn't disappear. He was taken, consumed, worn like a costume by something that should never have existed in our world. And somewhere in those twisted canyons, in a place that exists slightly outside normal reality, that thing still wears his face. Sometimes, late at night, I dream about that pool of black water. In the dreams, I can see David floating beneath the surface, his eyes wide and pleading, his mouth moving in silent screams. And standing around the pool's edge are dozens of other figures, all the people who've gone missing in the Superstition Mountains over the years, all of them trapped in their stolen bodies, all of them waiting for new victims to join their collection. The hardest part isn't the nightmares or the therapy or the way Christopher and I can barely look at each other anymore, both of us remembering what we saw in that canyon. The hardest part is knowing that David is still out there, somewhere in that place between reality and nightmare, aware of what's been done to him but powerless to stop it. And sometimes, on nights when the desert wind blows just right, I swear I can hear his voice calling my name from somewhere far away, begging me to come back for him. But I can never go back, because I know that if I do, the thing wearing David's face will be waiting for me by that pool of dark water, smiling with my friend's stolen smile, ready to add my voice to its collection of the consumed. The official reports call the Superstition Mountains dangerous because of the terrain, the heat, the possibility of getting lost. But they don't mention the real danger, the places where the barriers between worlds have worn thin, where hungry things wait to steal more than just your life. They wait to steal your very self, to wear you like a mask while your consciousness screams helplessly from within. David Jones was 29 years old when something stole his face. And in the twisted canyons of the Superstition Wilderness, in a place that exists just slightly outside our reality, that thing still wears it today. Christopher moved to Seattle 6 months later. He sends me Christmas cards, but we never talk about what happened. We can't. Because talking about it makes it real, makes it something that actually happened instead of just a shared delusion born of dehydration and panic. But late at night, when I'm alone in my apartment and the shadows seem to move independently of their sources, I know the truth. David is still out there, trapped in his own stolen body, watching through borrowed eyes as something ancient and hungry wears his face. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I wonder if the thing that came back from scouting for water that day was really fooling us at all. Maybe it wanted us to know. Maybe it wanted us to spread the story, to draw more people into the wilderness, more victims for its endless collection. Maybe this very telling is part of its plan. The thought haunts me, but I can't stop myself from sharing David's story. Because somewhere in the Superstition Mountains, in a canyon that doesn't appear on any map, my friend is still screaming, and I'm the only one who can hear him. My name is Michael Williams, and I am 34 years old. This happened in the Superstition Mountains of Arizona, about 40 miles east of Phoenix, where the desert meets jagged volcanic peaks that locals say are cursed. The corporate retreat was Sarah Rodriguez's idea. She'd been our department manager for 6 months and thought a weekend camping trip would build team morale after the Henderson account disaster nearly cost us all our jobs. I should have known something was wrong when she picked the most remote campsite in Lost Dutchman State Park, miles from the main trails where families with RVs usually gathered. "Trust me, Michael," Sarah had said, spreading topographic maps across the conference table. "Sometimes you need to get completely disconnected to reconnect with what matters." Her dark eyes gleamed with an intensity that made my skin crawl, but I attributed it to her notorious perfectionism. Kevin King, our graphics designer, was the first to complain when we reached the trailhead that Friday afternoon in October. The temperature gauge in my Jeep read 89 degrees, but the sun felt like it was burning holes through the atmosphere. "This place gives me the creeps," Kevin muttered, shouldering his oversized hiking pack. At 28, He was the youngest in our group, with pale skin that already showed signs of burning despite the sunscreen he'd slathered on. My grandfather used to tell stories about these mountains, said the Apache considered them sacred, and white folks who went in looking for gold never came out the same. Amanda Wright laughed, but it sounded forced. "Don't tell me you believe in ghost stories, Kevin." Our head of accounts receivable was tough as nails in business meetings, but I noticed how her eyes darted nervously toward the twisted saguaro cacti that dotted the landscape like ancient sentinels. The trail wound upward through creosote bush and palo verde trees, their green bark looking sickly in the harsh afternoon light. Every step kicked up clouds of red dust that clung to our clothes and invaded our nostrils with the metallic taste of iron. The silence was oppressive. No birds, no insects, just the scrape of our boots on loose rocks and the wheeze of Kevin's labored breathing. 2 hours in, Sarah stopped at a clearing surrounded by massive boulders that formed natural walls. "This is perfect," she announced, dropping her pack with satisfaction. "Private, defensible, and far enough from the main trail that we won't be disturbed." The word defensible struck me as odd. Defensible against what? We set up camp as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. My tent went up easily enough, but Kevin struggled with a cheap dome tent that kept collapsing every time he tried to stake down the rainfly. Amanda's tent was a high-end mountaineering model that looked like it could survive a hurricane, while Sarah had brought what appeared to be military surplus, all olive green canvas and steel poles. As dusk approached, the temperature dropped with shocking suddenness. Desert mountains are notorious for their temperature swings, but this felt different, like the heat was being actively drained from the air. I'd camped in Arizona before and knew to pack warm clothes, but the cold seemed to seep through my jacket and settle in my bones. We gathered around the fire pit Sarah had constructed with methodical precision, using rocks she'd selected and arranged with an almost ritualistic care. When Kevin tried to light the kindling, the flames flickered blue-green before settling into normal orange. "Weird," Kevin said, holding his lighter closer to examine it. "This thing's been working fine all day." "Copper in the rocks," Sarah explained smoothly. "It's common in this area. The mineral content affects flame color." I'd taken college chemistry and knew that wasn't quite right, but I let it slide. Sarah had always been the type to have an explanation for everything, even when she was clearly making it up. The conversation that followed felt stilted, like we were all reading from scripts we'd forgotten the words to. Amanda mentioned her divorce proceedings but kept trailing off mid-sentence and staring into the darkness beyond our circle of firelight. Kevin told a rambling story about his latest gaming obsession, but I caught him checking his phone every few minutes, frowning at the screen. "No signal?" I asked. "Weird thing is, I had 3 bars at the trailhead. Now it shows no network at all, like there's some kind of interference." Sarah smiled in the flickering light. "That's the whole point. Sometimes you need to be completely cut off from the outside world to find clarity." Around 10 p.m., Kevin excused himself to gather more firewood. The nearby desert didn't offer much in the way of dead branches, but he'd spotted what looked like the remains of an old saguaro cactus about 50 yards from camp. The massive cacti could live for 200 years, and when they finally died, their internal wooden ribs made excellent fuel. He disappeared into the darkness with his headlamp, the beam dancing between the scattered rocks and skeletal ocotillo plants. We heard him moving around for a while, the scrape of dead wood being collected, the occasional grunt of effort as he broke apart larger pieces. Then silence. "Kevin," Amanda called, "you okay out there?" No response. I grabbed my own headlamp and started toward the last place we'd seen his light. "Kevin, say something if you can hear me." The desert absorbed my voice like a sponge. I swept my beam in wide arcs, looking for any sign of him. The saguaro skeleton was there, partially dismantled, with a neat pile of ribs stacked nearby. But no Kevin. "His light just went out," Amanda said when I returned to the fire. She was standing now, arms wrapped around herself against the cold. 1 second it was there, The next second it wasn't. Sarah remained seated, poking at the fire with a long stick. He probably just went back to his tent. You know how Kevin is. Gets tired and just disappears without saying anything. But Kevin's tent was empty, his sleeping bag still rolled up and tied to his pack. We searched for an hour, calling his name and exploring every nearby gully and boulder field. Sarah seemed oddly calm about the whole thing, occasionally making suggestions but showing none of the urgency Amanda and I felt. When we finally returned to camp, exhausted and increasingly worried, she was sitting exactly where we'd left her. "We should hike back to the trailhead and get help," Amanda said. "Call the ranger station." "In the dark?" Sarah shook her head. "That trail is dangerous enough in daylight. People fall into arroyos and break their necks trying to navigate these mountains at night. Kevin probably just got disoriented and found a sheltered spot to wait until morning. He'll turn up." The logic was sound, but something in Sarah's tone made my stomach clench. There was a satisfaction there, like she was pleased with how things were developing. We kept the fire burning all night, taking turns staying awake to watch for Kevin's return. During my shift, from 2 to 4 a.m., I could have sworn I heard voices in the distance, not quite human, speaking in a language that sounded like wind through dried bones. But every time I tried to focus on the sounds, they faded into the ambient noise of the desert night. Amanda took the last watch, and I was drifting off to sleep when her scream shattered the pre-dawn quiet. I bolted upright, tangled in my sleeping bag, and saw her standing, frozen by the dying fire. She was pointing toward the eastern edge of our camp, where the first hint of sunrise was painting the peaks purple-black against the sky. Kevin was walking toward us. At first glance, he looked normal. Same clothes, same hiking boots, same slightly slouched posture he maintained when he was tired. But as he got closer, the wrongness became apparent. His movements were too fluid, like he was floating an inch above the ground. His face was expressionless, eyes fixed straight ahead without the darting glances and nervous energy that normally characterized his personality. "Kevin!" Amanda rushed toward him. "Where have you been? We've been looking everywhere for you." He stopped walking when she reached him, but he didn't respond to her questions. Just stood there, perfectly still, staring at something over her shoulder. When she waved a hand in front of his face, he blinked once. A slow, deliberate motion like a lizard. "I got lost," he said finally. His voice sounded right, but the timing was off, like there was a delay between the movement of his lips and the words coming out. "I found a cave. Slept there." "A cave?" I approached cautiously, that wrongness feeling growing stronger with each step. "Where? We didn't see any caves when we were searching." Kevin's head turned toward me with mechanical precision. "Deep cave. Very deep. Met some people there." The hair on my arms stood up. "What people? There's nobody else camping in this area." "Old people," Kevin said. "They knew me, knew my name." He smiled then, and it was the most horrifying thing I'd ever seen. The expression was anatomically correct, lips pulled back, teeth showing, but it was completely empty of any human emotion. Like someone had told him what a smile was supposed to look like without explaining what it meant. Sarah had been listening to this exchange without comment, but now she stood and walked over to us. "You must be exhausted," she said to Kevin. "Why don't you get some rest? We'll break camp in a few hours." Kevin nodded and walked to his tent with that same eerily smooth gait. We heard the zipper close, then nothing. "Something's wrong with him," Amanda whispered. "That's not Kevin. He's not acting like himself at all." "Shock," Sarah said dismissively. "He spent the night alone in an unfamiliar place. People react differently to trauma. Give him some time to decompress." But I'd noticed something else that made my blood run cold. Kevin's boots were clean. After walking through the desert for hours, allegedly sleeping in a cave, they should have been covered in dust and sand. Instead, they looked freshly scrubbed. We packed up camp in uncomfortable silence. Kevin emerged from his tent when we were nearly finished, moving with that same unnatural grace. He rolled up his sleeping bag and broke down his tent with mechanical efficiency, but he performed each task slightly wrong, rolling the bag too tight, folding the tent fabric in a pattern that left wrinkles and stress points. The hike back to the trailhead should have taken 2 hours. It took 5. The first problem was the trail itself. The path we'd followed up the mountain was clearly marked with cairns and worn into the desert floor by decades of foot traffic. But that morning, it seemed to dissolve and reappear at random intervals. We'd follow the obvious route for a quarter mile, then find ourselves at a dead end facing an impassable cliff or dense thicket of cholla cactus. "GPS is going crazy," Amanda said, staring at her phone screen in frustration. "According to this, we're walking in circles." My own phone showed the same thing, our position jumping around the screen like we were teleporting between different locations. The compass app spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. Sarah led us with supreme confidence, never consulting a map or GPS device. She seemed to know exactly where she was going, even when her chosen route took us deeper into the maze of canyons and washes that cut through the mountainside. Kevin followed her without question, still wearing that empty smile. He didn't speak unless directly addressed, and when he did respond, his answers were just slightly wrong. When Amanda asked if he was thirsty, he said, "Water is good." When I offered him a granola bar, he replied, "Food makes strong." The sun climbed higher, and the temperature soared past 100 degrees. We stopped frequently to rest in whatever shade we could find, but Kevin never seemed to need a break. He'd stand in the full sun, perfectly still, until Sarah gave the signal to continue walking. By noon, we were lost. "This is insane," Amanda said, wiping sweat from her forehead with a bandana that had turned brown with dust. "We're experienced hikers. You don't just lose a marked trail in broad daylight." "The mountains play tricks on people," Sarah said calmly. "That's why the Apache considered them sacred. The spirits here don't like to be disturbed." "Spirits?" I laughed, but it came out shaky and forced. "Come on. Sarah, you're a business manager, not a shaman." She turned to look at me then, and for just a moment, her expression shifted. The professional mask slipped, and I saw something ancient and hungry looking back at me through her eyes. Then she smiled her familiar manager smile, and I wondered if I'd imagined it. "Of course you're right," she said. "Just local folklore. But we should find shelter soon. Heat exhaustion is a real danger out here." She led us to a narrow canyon carved into the mountain's flank, its walls rising 50 feet on either side. The shade was a blessed relief, and we found a sandy area near the back wall where we could rest and eat lunch. That's when Amanda found the bones. She was looking for a private spot to relieve herself and had wandered deeper into the canyon when her scream echoed off the rock walls. We found her standing over what looked like a human rib cage, bleached white by the desert sun and partially buried in wind-blown sand. "Oh God," she whispered. "Oh God, there are more." She was right. Once we started looking, we found bones scattered throughout the canyon floor. Femurs and skulls, finger bones and pieces of spine, all cleaned so thoroughly they looked like medical school specimens. Some were obviously old, cracked, and weathered by years of exposure. Others looked disturbingly fresh. "Animals," Sarah said, examining a skull with what seemed like professional interest. "Coyotes, javelinas, maybe some human remains from old mining operations. The desert preserves bone very well." But I'd grown up on a cattle ranch in Montana, and I knew animal bones from human bones. These were definitely human, and there were far too many of them to be explained by mining accidents or getting lost in the desert. Kevin had been standing at the canyon entrance, but now he walked deeper into the bone field with his strange, gliding gait. He knelt beside a partially articulated skeleton and ran his fingers over the skull with gentle reverence. "They're beautiful," he said in that hollow voice. "So clean, so quiet." Amanda grabbed my arm. "We need to get out of here. Now." I couldn't have agreed more, but when we turned toward the canyon entrance, Sarah was blocking the way. She stood perfectly still with her arms at her sides, and for the first time since I'd known her, she looked genuinely relaxed. "I'm sorry," she said, and she actually did sound regretful. "I know this is frightening, but you need to understand. This isn't random. This isn't some camping trip gone wrong. You were chosen." "Chosen for what?" My voice cracked on the words. "To feed," Kevin answered from behind us. When I spun around, he was standing upright again, but his posture had changed. The slouch was gone, replaced by an predatory alertness that made him seem taller and more dangerous. "The old ones are so hungry, been hungry for so long." That's when I saw his eyes had changed color. Kevin had brown eyes, warm, friendly brown eyes that crinkled when he laughed. These eyes were yellow, with pupils that reflected light like an animal's. "What did you do to Kevin?" Amanda demanded, backing toward the canyon wall. "Kevin is fine," Sarah said. "He's just sharing his body for a while. The old ones don't have physical forms anymore. They need hosts to interact with the world." "You're insane," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I was remembering things that hadn't made sense before. Sarah's knowledge of the area, her confidence in navigation, the way she'd insisted on this particular campsite. "How long have you been planning this?" "Months," she admitted. "Ever since the old ones first contacted me. They showed me what I could become if I helped them feed. Power beyond anything you can imagine. Freedom from the mundane constraints of human existence." Kevin, or the thing wearing Kevin's body, was moving closer, and I could see his fingernails had grown into curved claws. His teeth, when he smiled, were pointed like a predator's. "The flesh is just a shell," he said in Kevin's voice. "Underneath, we're all just meat and bone and blood. The old ones help you see the truth." Amanda screamed. I've heard people scream in movies and television, but nothing prepared me for the sound Amanda made. It was pure animal terror, the noise a prey animal makes when it realizes it's trapped. The sound echoed off the canyon walls and seemed to go on forever. The thing wearing Kevin's body lunged toward her with inhuman speed. I threw myself forward, tackling it around the waist, and we crashed into the canyon wall together. Kevin's body felt wrong, too light, like there was nothing solid inside it. When I tried to pin it down, my hands passed through what should have been flesh and muscle, meeting only cold air. "You can't fight them," Sarah said conversationally. "They're not really physical anymore. What you're seeing is just a projection, a way for them to interact with matter when they need to." The Kevin thing stood up, unaffected by my tackle, and reached for Amanda with those impossible claws. She dodged, scrambling across the bone-littered sand, but there was nowhere to go. The canyon was a dead end, and Sarah still blocked the entrance. I grabbed a piece of bleached bone, a femur that felt solid and heavy in my hands, and swung it at the Kevin thing's head. It connected with a wet crack, and Kevin's body stumbled backward. For a moment, his eyes flickered back to brown, and he looked at me with desperate confusion. "Michael?" His voice was his own again, weak and terrified. "What's happening to me? I can't control." Then the yellow eyes returned and he snarled at me with those pointed teeth. "You only make it harder for him," Sarah said sadly. "The old ones don't like resistance. They prefer willing hosts, but they can take unwilling ones if necessary. The process is just messier." I swung the bone again, this time at Sarah. She caught it effortlessly in one hand, her fingers wrapping around the ancient calcium with inhuman strength. When she squeezed, the bone crumbled to powder. "I've been hosting one of them for months," she explained, "long enough for the changes to become permanent. Kevin is still fighting, which is why he seems unstable. Give it time, and he'll stop resisting." Amanda had found a gap between two large boulders and was trying to squeeze through, but she was too big to fit. The Kevin thing was stalking toward her with predatory patience, taking its time now that she was trapped. I needed a weapon, something more substantial than desert bones. I looked around desperately and spotted something that made my heart jump, a piece of rebar protruding from a rockfall near the canyon's back wall, probably left over from an old mining operation, rusted but still solid. I ran for it, grabbed the metal bar and yanked it free just as the Kevin thing reached Amanda. She was screaming again, that horrible animal sound, as impossible claws raked across her backpack and shredded the fabric. The rebar caught the thing in the center of its back with enough force to drive it face first into the boulder. This time, something vital seemed to be disrupted. Kevin's body convulsed, and when it turned around, both eyes were brown again. "Run!" he gasped, blood trickling from his nose. "Can't hold it much longer. Run!" Amanda squeezed out from behind the boulder and sprinted toward the canyon entrance. Sarah moved to intercept her, but I was ready this time. The rebar caught her in the side of the head with a metallic ringing sound, like striking a bell. She staggered, but didn't fall. When she looked at me, her face was no longer human. The skin had taken on a grayish pallor and her features were shifting, bones moving beneath the flesh like something was trying to reshape her from the inside. "You're making this so much harder than it needs to be," she said, but the voice wasn't hers anymore. It was older, speaking English with an accent I couldn't identify. "We only need one of you alive for the feeding. The others can die quickly." Amanda had reached the canyon entrance and was scrambling up the rocky slope toward the desert floor. I could hear her boots scraping against stone, dislodging small avalanches of gravel. Behind me, Kevin was fighting for control of his own body. I could see the struggle playing out across his features, his face contorting with effort, his hands clawing at his own throat like he was trying to strangle something inside. "Go," he managed to whisper. "I'll try to hold them." The Sarah thing was advancing again, its movements becoming less human with each step. The arms seemed too long now, and when it opened its mouth I saw rows of teeth that belonged in a shark's jaw. I ran. The canyon entrance was a steep scramble over loose rock and thorny vegetation, but adrenaline gave me strength and coordination I didn't know I possessed. Behind me, I could hear Kevin screaming, not in pain, but in rage, like he was fighting a war inside his own mind. Amanda was 50 yards ahead, running across the open desert toward a distant ridge. She'd dropped her pack somewhere and was moving with the desperate speed of someone who knows death is close behind. I caught up with her as we reached the base of the ridge, both of us gasping in the thin desert air. The temperature had to be over 110 degrees now, and the sun felt like a hammer against my skull. "We have to find the trail," Amanda panted. "Get back to the parking area." But when we looked back the way we'd come, the landscape was wrong. The canyon where we'd encountered the bones should have been visible from our position, but instead we saw only an unbroken expanse of desert scrub and rock formations. It was like the canyon had never existed. "That's impossible," I said. "We just came from there." Amanda was checking her phone again, but the screen showed nothing but static. "GPS is completely dead. Compass too. It's like we're in some kind of dead zone." We climbed the ridge, hoping to get our bearings. But the view from the top only made things worse. In every direction, the desert stretched to the horizon. No roads, no power lines, no signs of human civilization. The parking area where we'd left our cars was nowhere to be seen. "This is wrong," Amanda said, her voice tight with panic. "This is all wrong. We hiked for 2 hours yesterday. Even if we got turned around, we should be able to see something familiar." That's when we heard the howling. It started as a single voice, rising from somewhere behind us in a sound that was part human scream and part animal cry. Then other voices joined it, creating a chorus of inhuman noise that seemed to come from all directions at once. "They're hunting us," I realized. "Sarah and Kevin and whatever those things are." We ran down the far side of the ridge, abandoning any attempt at navigation or rational planning. The only goal now was distance, putting as much space as possible between us and those horrible sounds. The desert became a blur of cactus spines and loose rock, dry washes and crumbling cliff faces. We fell repeatedly, tearing skin and clothing on the harsh terrain, but kept moving. The howling followed us, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but never completely fading. My water ran out after an hour. Amanda's lasted slightly longer, but we were both showing signs of serious dehydration, cramping muscles, dizziness, the feeling that our blood was turning to sand. But we didn't dare stop to rest. The sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks when we found the road. It was a dirt track, barely 2 tire ruts carved into the desert floor, but it was definitely man-made. We followed it south, hoping it would lead to a main highway or at least a ranch where we could get help. The howling had stopped, but that somehow made things worse. At least when we could hear them, we knew where the threats were coming from. Now they could be anywhere, watching us from behind any boulder or stand of Ocotillo. 3 miles down the dirt road, we found the truck. It was an old Chevy pickup, probably from the 1980s, parked beside what looked like a surveyor's marker. The driver's door hung open, and there was no sign of whoever had driven it there. "Keys," Amanda whispered, peering through the windshield. "Keys are still in the ignition." I approached the truck cautiously, expecting some kind of trap, but it seemed genuinely abandoned. Empty beer cans in the bed, a layer of dust on the dashboard, work gloves on the passenger seat. The engine turned over on the 3rd try, coughing to life with a rumble that sounded like salvation. Amanda climbed into the passenger seat, and we followed the dirt road as it wound through increasingly familiar terrain. 20 minutes later, we reached the paved highway that led back to Phoenix. The ranger station at Lost Dutchman State Park was skeptical of our story. 2 park rangers and a sheriff's deputy listened with professional patience as we described the camping trip, Kevin's disappearance, and our encounter with the bones in the canyon. But when we got to the parts about possession and shape-shifting and supernatural entities, their expressions grew carefully neutral. "So you're saying your co-workers are still out there?" the deputy asked, taking notes. "Not our co-workers," Amanda said firmly. "Something that looks like our co-workers. Something that killed them and took their bodies." The deputy exchanged a glance with the senior ranger. "We'll organize a search party. Can you show us on a map where you think this canyon is located?" I tried, but the topographic maps they showed me didn't match what I remembered. According to the official surveys, there was no canyon in the area where we'd found the bones. The terrain was marked as a gentle slope with scattered rock formations. "Heat exhaustion can cause hallucinations," the ranger explained gently. "Dehydration affects cognitive function. You've been through a traumatic experience." They found the truck's owner 3 days later. Frank Valdez, a local surveyor, had been reported missing by his family when he didn't return from a routine mapping job. His body was discovered at the bottom of an arroyo 15 miles from where we'd found his truck, with injuries consistent with a fall from height. The official investigation concluded that Amanda and I had suffered a shared psychological breakdown, triggered by Kevin's accidental death and our subsequent exposure to extreme heat. Kevin's body was never found, despite an extensive search involving helicopters and trained search dogs. Sarah Rodriguez had apparently left the camping trip early and driven back to Phoenix, but she never returned to work, and her apartment was found empty. The case was filed as a missing persons investigation with probable death by misadventure. Amanda quit her job and moved back to Oregon to live with her sister. We talked a few times after the incident, but the conversations always turned to questions neither of us could answer. She started seeing a therapist who specialized in trauma recovery, and the last time we spoke, she said the sessions were helping her process what had happened as a stress-induced hallucination. I tried to convince myself of the same thing. For a while, it almost worked. But 6 months later, I was grocery shopping in Phoenix when I saw Kevin King in the produce section. He was examining apples with the same methodical precision he'd once used to adjust font kerning in graphic design projects. Same clothes, same slightly slouched posture, same nervous energy. But when he looked up and our eyes met across the store, I saw something that made my blood freeze. His eyes were yellow, and when he smiled at me, his teeth were pointed like a predator's. I ran out of the store and sat in my car for 20 minutes, shaking too hard to start the engine. When I finally worked up the courage to go back inside, he was gone. 3 weeks after that, I got a call from Amanda. "I saw Sarah," she said without preamble, "at the Portland airport. She was getting off a flight from Phoenix. Are you sure it was her?" "Positive. But Michael, she looked exactly the same. Not like 6 months had passed, like she hadn't aged a single day." We agreed to meet the next weekend to compare notes and figure out what to do next. Amanda never showed up. Her sister called the police when she didn't return from what should have been a 2-hour drive to the airport. They found her car abandoned on Highway 26, keys still in the ignition, driver's door hanging open. She's been missing for 3 months now. I've been thinking about moving somewhere far from Arizona, maybe Alaska, where the nights are long and the wilderness is different. But I have a terrible feeling that distance won't matter. They know where I am now. They know what I've seen. And sometimes late at night when the desert wind rattles my windows, I hear howling in the distance. Last week, I found a business card slipped under my apartment door. It was Sarah's old card from our accounting firm, but someone had written a message on the back in Kevin's handwriting. "We miss you, Michael. Come camping with us again soon." I know they're waiting out there in the Superstition Mountains, in places that don't appear on any map, waiting for me to join Kevin and Amanda and all the others whose bones bleach white in that impossible canyon. But I also know something they might not expect. I've been preparing. Tonight, I'm going back to the mountains. Not to join them, but to end this. I've spent months researching Native American folklore, learning about the spirits that inhabit the desert wilderness. I know what they are now, and I know how to fight them. The old ones are hungry, but they're not invincible, and I still have that piece of rebar. If you're reading this, it means I didn't make it back, but maybe I hurt them enough to keep them from hunting anyone else. Maybe the next group of hikers who venture into the Superstition Mountains will find nothing more dangerous than heat stroke and dehydration. Or maybe they'll find my bones, picked clean and scattered across the desert floor like all the others. Either way, don't go looking for that canyon. Some places are meant to stay lost.